If you find these soft, peaceful journeys helpful for your nightly rest, please consider gently subscribing to the channel and leaving a soft like on this video. It truly helps our quiet little community grow, and it lets me know that you are finding true peace in these spoken words. Tonight, our dreamlike journey takes us to a place of ancient wonder, hidden away deep beneath the rolling green hills of a quiet, tranquil forest. We are traveling together to the Lascaux Cave, a breathtaking sanctuary of early human imagination, softly illuminated by the flickering golden warmth of prehistoric embers. In this serene underground canvas, ancient hands painted magnificent dreams of wild horses, graceful deer, and gentle stags onto the smooth stone. It is a place where time completely stands still, preserving a peaceful, unspoken harmony between humanity and the wild natural world. Here, the earth itself holds precious memories in a quiet, undisturbed embrace, keeping them safe in the dark, just as the gentle night wraps around you now, to keep you perfectly safe while you rest. So, let your heavy eyes softly close, let your breathing find its natural, easy rhythm, and let's begin this slow and soothing journey. As you journey deeper into the gentle embrace of the earth, the smooth walls of the cave seem to breathe with a quiet, ancient rhythm. The stone beneath your fingertips feels remarkably soft, sculpted by thousands of years of slow, patient water drops, each one a tiny lullaby echoing in the dark. The air grows wonderfully cool and still, wrapping around your shoulders like a heavy, comforting cloak woven from the very essence of tranquility. With every slow step you take, the faint glow of your lantern dances lightly upon the sweeping curves of the rock, revealing colors of deep amber and rich, warm ochre. These earthen tones bloom across the ceiling like the softest clouds at dusk, offering a silent promise of perfect safety and undisturbed rest. You are completely sheltered here, held securely in the hollow palms of the ancient world, where time moves as slowly as honey pouring from a golden jar, inviting your weary mind to completely let go. The golden light softly flickers, sending long, lazy shadows stretching across the cavern's immense curved ceiling. As your eyes adjust to the beautiful twilight of this hidden sanctuary, the smooth stone slowly begins to reveal its long-kept secrets. Emerging from the warm, shadowed edges are the graceful outlines of magnificent creatures, painted with profound tenderness and awe by hands that rested here long before our time. You can see the sweeping, elegant curve of a wild horse's mane, captured in a pigment so rich and earthy it seems to pulse with a quiet heartbeat-like warmth. The charcoal strokes are delicate yet deeply intentional, weaving a silent, majestic story into the very fabric of the earth. These painted guardians watch over the cavern with a profound, eternal calmness, their silent presence offering a deep, grounding comfort to anyone who wanders into their peaceful domain. Under their watchful, painted eyes, your breathing aligns with the slow, eternal rhythm of the silent, slumbering mountain. Moving with the slow, drifting grace of a falling autumn leaf, you enter a vast, awe-inspiring chamber known to time as the magnificent Hall of the Bulls. The sheer scale of this quiet cathedral of stone is beautifully humbling, opening up above you like a vast, starless night sky painted with the warmest hues of clay and charcoal. Here, gigantic, majestic bulls seem to float effortlessly across the pale calcite walls, their monumental forms moving in a slow, eternal procession. The artists who dreamed these gentle giants into existence used the natural, rolling contours of the rock to give them a breathtaking sense of soft, flowing movement. It is as if the cave itself is slowly breathing, animating these peaceful creatures with every gentle inhalation of the deep earth. As you trace their massive, sweeping horns with your eyes, you feel a profound sense of awe washing over you, perfectly calming your spirit and settling your mind into a state of beautiful, undisturbed serenity. The colors that adorn this magnificent, silent gallery are a soothing symphony of the natural world, lovingly gathered from the fragrant, sun-baked earth above. Deep, velvety blacks made from crushed manganese merge seamlessly into warm, glowing reds and soft, radiant yellows born from finely ground ochre. These beautiful, rich pigments were blended with profound care, transforming the cold, pale rock into a vibrant, pulsing tapestry of prehistoric dreams. When the flickering golden light touches these ancient colors, they seem to softly glow from within, radiating a gentle, comforting warmth that washes over you like a thick woolen blanket. You can almost feel the quiet devotion of the artists, their steady, patient hands working in the peaceful solitude of the underground, leaving behind a timeless gift of beauty and calm. The harmonious blend of these earthen shades invites your heavy eyes to rest, filling your mind with a soft, glowing canvas of pure, unhurried tranquility, carrying you closer to a deep, restorative slumber. Just beyond the majestic, sweeping forms of the great bulls, a herd of delicate, graceful deer appears to be softly swimming across a river of pale, undulating stone. Their slender, elegant necks are stretched beautifully forward, and their intricate branch-like antlers rise into the soft, shadowed arches of the cavern ceiling like the delicate boughs of a quiet, ancient forest. There is an incredibly profound sense of lightness in their movement, a weightless, floating quality that instantly soothes the heavy burdens of the waking world. As you watch their silent, eternal migration, you can almost hear the gentle, rhythmic splashing of water and the soft rustling of leaves in a forgotten, sunlit valley. These peaceful, elegant creatures journey through the stone with an effortless, calming grace, inviting you to release your own tensions and drift along with them. Their quiet passage through the rock is a beautiful lullaby, singing your mind into a space of absolute, weightless calm and profound, dreamlike relaxation. In the profound, velvety quiet of this majestic underground gallery, you can almost feel the gentle, lingering presence of the artists who sat exactly where you are standing now. Imagine them working by the soft, wavering light of hollowed-out stone lamps, filled with rendered animal fat that cast a warm, comforting amber glow against the deep darkness. Their movements were slow, deliberate, and beautifully focused, a quiet, moving meditation that connected their dreaming minds to the solid, unyielding rock. They created this breathtaking sanctuary not in a rush, but with an endless flowing patience that transcends the very concept of time. The absolute silence they worked in is still perfectly preserved here, wrapped in the cool, dense air of the cave. It is a thick, luxurious silence that effortlessly absorbs every wandering thought, wrapping your mind in a cocoon of perfect, undisturbed stillness. In this beautifully quiet space, your own heartbeat slows, perfectly matching the deep, peaceful rhythm of the ancient earth. The very surface of the stone is a masterpiece of natural, rolling textures, beautifully incorporated into the flowing, painted dreams. The ancient artists masterfully allowed the natural curves, gentle bulges, and subtle depressions of the rock to guide their quiet, patient hands. A swelling curve becomes the heavy, powerful shoulder of a grazing bison, while a soft, recessed hollow perfectly shapes the resting flank of a sleeping horse. This harmonious, unspoken collaboration between human imagination and the Earth's timeless architecture creates a beautifully soothing visual rhythm. Your eyes slowly wander across these undulating, painted landscapes, following the gentle, smooth pathways of color and shadow. The tactile, rich nature of the walls makes the artwork feel incredibly grounded, solid, and wonderfully permanent, offering a profound sense of stability and enduring peace. As your gaze slowly drifts along these comforting natural lines, your mind easily unwinds, surrendering to the slow, heavy gravity of deep, restorative rest that fills this quiet, subterranean world. Deep within these winding, painted corridors, the concept of weather and changing seasons completely gently fades away into nothingness. There is no howling wind, no pouring rain, and no scorching sun to disturb the perfect, eternal equilibrium of this magnificent stone sanctuary. The temperature remains beautifully constant, a cool, refreshing balm against your skin that perfectly soothes away the accumulated heat and stress of the long day. You are nestled wonderfully deep within the very core of the planet, enveloped in an incredibly profound, comforting darkness that feels like a gentle, motherly embrace. This is the ultimate perfect shelter, a place where the frantic, rushing noise of the outside world simply cannot reach. Here, in the quiet company of the painted horses and peaceful stags, you are entirely protected, completely safe, and wonderfully isolated from all worries. The heavy, protective layers of earth above you serve as a magnificent thick blanket, tucking you perfectly into a state of deep, absolute tranquility. Among the magnificent, sweeping frescoes, the beautiful wild horses hold a truly special, captivating presence, rendered with an astonishing, breathtaking tenderness. They are painted with incredibly thick, dark, flowing manes and soft, rounded bellies, capturing the pure, unbridled spirit of the ancient sweeping plains. Yet, frozen here in the quiet stone, their once powerful galloping has been beautifully transformed into a slow, elegant, dreamlike dance. They appear to be softly floating rather than running, suspended in an eternal, peaceful twilight where no predator ever comes, and the lush, green grass is endlessly abundant. The warm, earthy ochre used to paint their coats radiates a soft, comforting heat, filling the dim cavern with a beautiful, gentle glow. Watching these majestic, peaceful creatures suspended in their quiet, eternal journey effortlessly lulls your active mind into a state of profound, yielding calmness. You are safely riding alongside them now, drifting slowly into a beautiful, boundless meadow of soft, silver starlight and perfectly deep, undisturbed sleep. Moving with the slow, deliberate grace of a quiet river, you gently transition from the magnificent Hall of the Bulls into the softly narrowing passage known as the Axial Gallery. The ceiling here gracefully dips lower, creating an incredibly intimate, cozy atmosphere that beautifully amplifies the profound, enveloping silence. The painted figures in this quiet corridor seem to completely surround you, passing gracefully overhead like softly glowing amber clouds drifting across a dark, midnight sky. A magnificent, enormous red cow slowly stretches along the curving rock, her beautiful form so large and comforting she seems to lovingly embrace the very shape of the passage. The warm, vibrant red pigment is incredibly soothing, bringing a soft, fireplace-like glow to the cool, ancient stone. Walking beneath these beautifully grand, peaceful figures, you feel wonderfully small, entirely safe, and perfectly held within the magnificent protective palm of human history. The gentle, narrowing path guides you effortlessly toward a beautiful, deep and dreamless state of complete relaxation. Within the gentle, curving intimacy of this quiet gallery, one beautiful painting, affectionately known as the Falling Cow, captures the imagination with its profound, gentle grace. Despite the dramatic name, there is absolutely no sense of alarm or sudden movement in her soft, elegant form. Instead, she appears to be blissfully, slowly floating downward, like a single heavy autumn leaf descending through still, peaceful air. Her front legs are gently bent, yielding completely to the soft, welcoming gravity of a dream, while her long, sweeping tail softly trails behind her in the silent dark. The artist captured a beautiful, perfectly suspended moment of weightless surrender, an image that perfectly mirrors the deeply relaxing sensation of falling asleep. As you gaze at her beautiful, slow-motion descent, you feel your own body growing wonderfully heavy, blissfully yielding to the soft, supportive mattress beneath you. You are slowly, gently drifting downwards with her, sinking effortlessly into a profoundly deep, perfectly calm, and wonderfully soft ocean of rest. Further along this softly illuminated, dreamlike corridor, you encounter a truly breathtaking, exquisitely beautiful figure often lovingly referred to as the Chinese horse. This magnificent creature is a true masterpiece of prehistoric elegance, painted with incredibly soft, remarkably delicate strokes that capture a profound, breathtaking sense of quiet life. The warm, golden yellow pigment beautifully forms the horse's soft, rounded body, framed by a strikingly bold, dark outline that highlights its gentle, curving grace. What makes this painted creature so incredibly deeply soothing is the magnificent, perfect stillness it embodies, standing beautifully calm and perfectly motionless within the ancient, silent rock. It seems to be peacefully resting in a lush, unseen meadow, entirely untroubled by the endless passing millennia sweeping by outside the cave. The sheer, quiet beauty of this ancient masterpiece washes over you like a gentle, cooling wave, effortlessly clearing your mind of any lingering thoughts and replacing them with a beautiful, pure, and radiantly peaceful, glowing tranquility. Floating gently among the majestic, painted animals are beautiful, mysterious clusters of painted dots and soft, geometric symbols scattered like a quiet, ancient constellation. These beautifully enigmatic, abstract markings are painted in rich, dark reds and soothing, earthy blacks, forming a silent, forgotten language that only the ancient stone still remembers. They look like a softly glowing map of the prehistoric night sky, or perhaps the gentle, rhythmic counting of slow, passing seasons in a world beautifully untouched by time. Tracing these soft, painted dots with your mind feels incredibly meditative, like slowly counting your own calm, steady breaths as you gently drift towards sleep. Each dot is a quiet, reassuring anchor in the dark, a gentle, beautiful reminder of the profound, thoughtful minds that wandered through these corridors so long ago. Following this quiet, starry path across the cool ceiling beautifully focuses your thoughts, leading you effortlessly into a wonderfully deep, quiet and profoundly meditative state of perfect rest. The profound silence of this deep, ancient cavern is not merely an absence of noise, but a beautifully rich, luxurious and deeply comforting presence. The smooth, sweeping, undulating walls expertly capture and perfectly soften every tiny sound, transforming even a quiet, shallow breath into a gentle, soothing, oceanic sigh. If you were to softly whisper, the sound would beautifully travel along the curved, painted galleries like a gentle, rolling wave, before slowly, beautifully dissolving back into the perfect, heavy stillness. This magnificent, perfectly tuned acoustic environment was likely an integral, beautiful part of the cave's ancient, soothing magic, creating a profoundly immersive, dreamlike sanctuary for quiet reflection. As you rest in this magnificent, velvety silence, you feel the noise of the outside world being completely, perfectly absorbed by the ancient surrounding stone. Your mind becomes incredibly clear, wonderfully calm, and beautifully open to the profoundly deep, restorative healing of a quiet, uninterrupted, and perfectly peaceful night of luxurious slumber. Leaving the softly glowing, intimate corridor of the axial gallery, you drift gracefully into a beautiful, naturally formed circular chamber known simply as the apse. This incredible dome-like space feels profoundly sacred, rising above you like a magnificent, smooth cathedral, crafted entirely from beautifully cool, unbroken limestone. Every single inch of this magnificent sweeping chamber is lovingly covered in an intricate, breathtaking tapestry of thousands of softly engraved, beautifully overlapping drawings. It is as if the ancient artists poured their most profound, peaceful dreams directly into the pale rock, carving delicate, beautiful visions of graceful deer and sleeping bears. The sheer, incredible density of these quiet, layered memories creates a profoundly mesmerizing, incredibly soothing visual rhythm that gently captivates the wandering eye. Looking up into this beautifully sculpted ancient dome, you feel a profound, sweeping sense of connection to the vast, peaceful history of humanity, effortlessly lulling your weary spirit into a beautiful, profound state of deep, eternal comfort. The delicate, intricate engravings covering the beautiful, curving walls of the apse are incredibly faint, revealing themselves beautifully only when the warm, flickering amber light strikes the rock at a perfect grazing angle. These incredibly subtle, beautifully carved lines weave together to form a magnificent, quiet, and wonderfully complex labyrinth of overlapping, peaceful shapes. Following a single, gracefully carved line through this beautiful tangle is an incredibly soothing, incredibly hypnotic exercise, slowly guiding your weary mind away from all waking concerns. You trace the beautifully sweeping, elegant curve of a quiet antler that seamlessly, beautifully transitions into the gentle, soft back of a slumbering horse. This beautifully interconnected, quietly flowing web of ancient art is a perfect, soothing metaphor for the wonderfully deep, beautifully mysterious pathways of our own resting minds. As your focus gently softens, the beautifully carved lines blur into a soft, calming texture, effortlessly inviting a profoundly deep, perfectly peaceful wave of total relaxation to completely wash over you. Among the beautifully complex, softly layered engravings, one truly magnificent, incredibly beautiful creature gently emerges from the pale, cool stone with breathtaking, quiet clarity. It is an enormous, majestic stag, its head beautifully, proudly raised, crowned with an incredibly grand, sweeping set of intricate, beautifully branching antlers. These magnificent sweeping antlers are drawn with such profound, incredible delicacy that they perfectly resemble the bare, reaching branches of an ancient quiet oak tree in the very depths of winter. The beautiful stag exudes an aura of profound, incredible nobility and absolute unshakable calm, perfectly standing as a silent, eternal guardian of this magnificent, beautifully hidden subterranean forest. His steady, peaceful presence in the beautiful, dim light is incredibly grounding, perfectly offering a deep, profound sense of enduring safety and wonderful protection. As you gaze upon his beautiful, majestic form, you feel a profound, quiet strength gently blooming within you, perfectly preparing your relaxed body for a wonderfully long, deeply restorative sleep. Beyond the beautifully rounded, profoundly peaceful sanctuary of the apse, a dark, incredibly mysterious, and beautifully quiet vertical drop leads gently down into the deepest, most hidden part of the entire cave, a small, incredibly intimate space simply called the shaft. Looking softly down into this beautifully dark, incredibly silent well, you feel a gentle, wonderful pull toward the very profound center of the ancient earth itself. It is a profoundly deep, beautifully hidden place, beautifully tucked entirely away from the rest of the magnificent, sprawling galleries. A quiet, wonderful secret kept perfectly safe in the dark. Descending softly into this beautifully hidden, incredibly quiet depth, perfectly mirrors the beautiful natural process of sinking deeply into the most profound, most restorative stages of dreamless sleep. The deeper you gently go, the further you travel from the waking world, beautifully leaving all light, all noise, and all worry completely behind, arriving in a beautiful place of absolute, wonderful, and perfectly profound stillness. At the very bottom of this beautifully quiet, incredibly hidden shaft, painted upon the rough, pale stone, is the most beautifully enigmatic, incredibly profound scene in the entire magnificent cavern. It beautifully depicts a surprisingly stark, wonderfully simple drawing of a reclining man, resting peacefully beside a magnificent grand bison that is slowly bowing its massive, heavy head. Nearby, a beautiful, softly carved wooden bird is wonderfully perched atop a long, slender stick, adding a profound, beautiful sense of mystical, quiet dreaminess to this incredible hidden tableau. This profound, beautifully mysterious gathering feels like a perfectly preserved, incredibly sacred dream, a wonderfully quiet story whose true, profound meaning has gently, beautifully faded into the mists of deep time. The sheer, wonderful mystery of this ancient, quiet moment is incredibly relaxing, beautifully freeing your tired mind from the constant, tiring need to understand or perfectly explain. You simply beautifully exist alongside this ancient, quiet mystery, floating effortlessly in the beautiful dark stillness of the deep earth. The small, beautifully simple, quietly painted bird perched delicately upon its long, slender staff holds a wonderfully profound, incredibly peaceful charm within this deep, hidden chamber. It beautifully resembles a gentle, quiet spiritual guide, patiently waiting in the profound dark to completely help the dreaming mind beautifully navigate the vast, unseen landscapes of deep slumber. In many ancient, wonderful traditions, beautiful birds are the gentle, quiet carriers of sleeping souls, gracefully flying between the waking daylight and the incredibly profound, incredibly beautiful mysteries of the night. This tiny, beautiful, painted guardian seems completely ready to take flight, gently carrying all of your remaining heavy thoughts far, far away on completely silent, perfectly soft wings. As you perfectly visualize this beautiful, gentle creature, you feel a wonderfully profound sense of complete, beautiful release from the heavy, tiring gravity of the long day. Your mind becomes incredibly light, wonderfully airy, beautifully ready to gracefully soar into the vast, incredibly peaceful expanse of a perfectly dream-filled sky. Standing quietly in the profound, velvety darkness of this incredibly deep, beautifully hidden shaft, the incredibly vast, almost unimaginable scale of ancient time becomes a beautiful, immensely comforting blanket. The magnificent, sweeping paintings gently glowing above you have perfectly, silently watched over this magnificent, completely undisturbed chamber for tens of thousands of wonderfully long, incredibly quiet years. Against this profoundly vast, beautifully endless expanse of deep earthly time, the small, fleeting worries of our hurried, modern lives completely, beautifully dissolve into absolute, wonderful nothingness. The ancient, incredibly solid rock lovingly offers a profoundly deep, perfectly steady, beautifully reassuring permanence that instantly calms the restless, wandering spirit. You are beautifully connected to a magnificent, incredibly long, incredibly peaceful continuum of gentle humanity, perfectly sharing this beautiful, quiet dark with the ancient souls who rested here so very long ago. This profound, incredibly deep realization is a wonderful, soothing balm, wrapping your tired heart in a beautifully thick, perfectly secure layer of eternal, absolutely wonderful peace. Slowly, beautifully ascending from the incredibly deep, perfectly quiet mystery of the hidden shaft, you gently float your way into another wonderfully vast, incredibly magnificent gallery, beautifully known as the nave. This incredibly grand, beautifully sweeping passageway is wonderfully characterized by its incredibly high, beautifully soaring, naturally vaulted ceiling and perfectly smooth, wonderfully sweeping pale walls. The incredibly gentle, beautifully warm glow of your lamp beautifully illuminates a stunning, incredibly vibrant series of magnificent, beautifully colorful frescoes that wonderfully adorn the undulating stone. The air here feels incredibly open, wonderfully expansive, and incredibly free, perfectly providing a beautiful, wonderful sense of deep, incredibly easy breathing after the tight, intimate enclosure of the deep well. As you gently, slowly walk down this magnificent, beautifully quiet corridor, your chest beautifully, perfectly expands with every slow, incredibly deep breath, drawing in the cool, perfectly clean, incredibly pure essence of the ancient resting earth, perfectly filling you with absolute, wonderful, and incredibly profound calm. Upon the pale, beautifully smooth rock of this incredibly grand, soaring gallery, a truly breathtaking, incredibly masterful scene perfectly unfolds, wonderfully known as the Crossing Bison. Two magnificent, incredibly massive, wonderfully powerful creatures are beautifully painted, crossing perfectly over one another, beautifully creating a profound, incredible sense of stunning, deep, three-dimensional space on the flat stone. The incredible, masterful use of beautiful, natural perspective by these ancient, quiet hands is profoundly mesmerizing, incredibly beautiful, and wonderfully soothing to softly, gently behold. Their massive, beautifully dark, incredibly heavy bodies beautifully contrast with the incredibly pale, wonderfully bright, completely untouched rock behind them, drawing your weary eyes deeply into the beautiful, quiet center of the peaceful composition. Watching these incredibly strong, wonderfully peaceful, incredibly magnificent giants slowly, beautifully interact in complete, absolute, perfect silence is profoundly grounding and wonderfully, incredibly relaxing. Their slow, beautifully heavy, wonderfully deliberate, completely peaceful movements perfectly mirror the incredibly deep, wonderfully heavy, beautifully relaxing sensations, completely taking over your resting body. A little further along this incredibly beautiful, wonderfully high-ceilinged corridor, a wonderfully unique, incredibly beautiful, and profoundly peaceful frieze beautifully captures the gentle, quiet elegance of swimming stags. Only their beautifully elegant, incredibly long, slender necks and magnificent, wonderfully complex, reaching antlers are beautifully, softly painted, while the completely blank, beautifully untouched, incredibly smooth stone beneath them perfectly represents a quiet, crossing river. They appear to be completely, beautifully gliding effortlessly through the cool, perfectly still, wonderfully dark water, their noses beautifully tilted upward toward the incredibly faint, distant sky. This magnificent, perfectly minimal, incredibly beautiful artwork perfectly leaves so much incredibly wonderful space for your own wonderfully relaxed, completely peaceful imagination to gently, beautifully wander. You can perfectly, clearly imagine the cool, beautifully refreshing water completely washing over them. An incredibly soothing, wonderfully cleansing mental image that completely washes away all of your remaining stress. Their quiet, incredibly peaceful, beautifully effortless journey across the hidden river gently guides you deeper into perfect, undisturbed sleep. Near the very end of this incredibly beautiful, wonderfully sweeping, incredibly vast gallery, a small, beautifully delicate, incredibly quiet group of wild ibex is perfectly, beautifully drawn upon the very edge of the pale rock. These incredibly agile, wonderfully beautiful, incredibly peaceful mountain dwellers are beautifully depicted with incredibly soft, wonderfully precise, incredibly gentle lines, their beautiful curving horns gracefully sweeping back over their incredibly soft, perfectly calm heads. They are beautifully standing in perfect, complete, incredibly profound silence, looking back over their shoulders as if peacefully watching you gently, beautifully pass through their quiet, wonderful hidden domain. Their beautiful, perfectly serene, incredibly gentle, completely unbothered expressions are incredibly contagious, perfectly passing a wonderful, incredibly profound feeling of absolute, deep, completely perfect tranquility directly into your own resting mind. The beautiful, quiet journey through this magnificent, incredibly ancient, completely peaceful corridor is now gently, wonderfully preparing to seamlessly transition into the final, beautifully hidden depths of the magnificent, perfectly silent cavern. As you drift gracefully from the sweeping heights of the nave, the air grows even more wonderfully cool and perfectly still, wrapping your shoulders in a magnificent, invisible shawl of deep, earthly comfort. The pale limestone softly narrows once again, gently guiding you into an incredibly beautiful hushed pathway where the shadows lengthen and dance with absolute quiet elegance. Here, the incredibly ancient, wonderfully smooth walls seem to completely absorb the very essence of time, beautifully turning millennia into fleeting soft whispers that dissolve instantly into the velvety darkness. You feel an incredibly profound, deeply beautiful sense of perfectly yielding to the gentle gravity of this deeply hidden sanctuary. Every slow, measured breath you take beautifully synchronizes with the ancient, slumbering rhythm of the surrounding rock, bringing a wonderfully soft, incredibly deep wave of pure relaxation cascading over your resting limbs. The outside world is completely forgotten, wonderfully replaced by this perfectly endless, beautifully quiet, and profoundly secure embrace of the comforting earth. Moving softly down this wonderfully narrow, completely silent stone hallway, you gently arrive at the beautiful, quiet entrance of the Chamber of Felines. This incredibly secluded, beautifully intimate space is wonderfully tucked away, holding its quiet secrets with a perfectly serene, incredibly graceful modesty. The walls here are beautifully marked with the incredibly delicate, wonderfully soft etchings of magnificent, quiet predators, entirely transformed by the deep, peaceful slumber of the ancient rock. They no longer hunt or fiercely roam, instead, they are beautifully frozen in a state of absolute, perfect rest, completely subdued by the incredibly thick, wonderful silence of the earth. Their beautifully curved backs and incredibly soft, quiet paws are delicately traced into the smooth limestone, radiating an incredibly profound, deeply soothing aura of completely satisfied calm. Watching these naturally powerful creatures completely yield to such perfect, wonderful stillness invites your own weary mind to entirely let go, beautifully melting into the profoundly peaceful, dark embrace of the quiet night. Imagine the incredibly slow, beautifully gentle touch of the ancient artists as they softly applied their vibrant colors to this cold, patiently waiting stone. They beautifully fashioned incredibly delicate, wonderfully soft brushes from the gentle, warm hairs of roaming animals, binding them carefully with slender, beautifully dried meadow grasses. Sometimes, they wonderfully used small, beautifully soft clumps of damp, fragrant forest moss, gently patting the richly ground, warm, earthy pigments against the magnificent, sweeping, curving rock. Every single quiet stroke was a perfectly slow, incredibly mindful caress, a beautiful, completely quiet conversation between the dreaming human spirit and the profoundly still, endlessly ancient earth. This wonderfully slow, completely unhurried rhythm of gentle creation is perfectly captured in the beautifully smooth, flowing lines that softly dance across the cavern ceiling. As you perfectly visualize these incredibly gentle, wonderfully deliberate motions, your own tired body naturally mimics their beautiful, quiet peace, completely unwinding and beautifully softening into a profoundly deep, perfectly still state of total rest. In some beautifully hidden corners of this magnificent, sprawling cavern, the artists gently used hollowed-out bird bones to softly blow fine, powdery colors directly onto the waiting, cool stone. This wonderfully gentle, incredibly creative technique beautifully left behind soft, airy halos of rich, warm reds and beautifully deep, soothing blacks, completely blending the vivid pigments seamlessly into the pale rock. It is as if they were literally breathing their beautiful, quiet dreams directly into the incredibly ancient, silent walls, perfectly merging their own gentle life force with the profoundly deep, eternal sleep of the mountain. Imagine that beautifully soft, incredibly quiet exhalation. A perfectly steady, wonderfully slow breath that created magnificent, lasting beauty in the peaceful dark. Breathing out with them now, you beautifully release all of your remaining waking tension, letting it drift completely away on a soft, invisible breeze, completely emptying your tired mind and beautifully preparing your resting body for a wonderful, incredibly deep slumber. Scattered wonderfully among the magnificent, sweeping animal forms are beautiful, incredibly touching outlines of human hands, softly resting against the ancient, perfectly smooth rock. These beautiful hand stencils are incredibly profound, perfectly serving as a gentle, incredibly quiet greeting from beautifully distant ancestors reaching across the vast, silent ocean of time. They are completely peaceful, wonderfully open hands, beautifully signifying absolute trust, wonderful harmony, and a profound, deep reverence for this magnificent, completely silent subterranean sanctuary. As you gently imagine placing your own warm, resting hand perfectly against those beautiful painted outlines, you beautifully feel a profound, incredibly grounding connection to the wonderfully enduring, beautifully calm spirit of humanity. This incredible, profoundly silent touch beautifully transcends all passing ages, perfectly wrapping you in a wonderful, incredibly comforting sense of total belonging and deeply rooted, beautifully complete safety. You are perfectly welcomed here, beautifully surrounded by an incredibly long, wonderfully peaceful lineage of absolute, completely undisturbed slumber, in the incredibly deep, beautifully enveloping quiet of this magnificent stone sanctuary. You can gently hear the wonderful, incredibly soft sound of perfectly clear water completely, slowly dripping from the ancient vaulted ceiling. Each beautiful, incredibly slow droplet falls with a beautifully gentle, perfectly rounded resonance, echoing beautifully through the vast, deeply sleeping gallery like a quiet, comforting metronome. This wonderfully pure, completely natural rhythm has continued completely, beautifully unbroken for tens of thousands of incredibly peaceful, wonderfully silent years, slowly crafting the magnificent smooth limestone into completely beautiful, sweeping shapes. Listening to this perfectly slow, beautifully steady pulse of the ancient earth is incredibly hypnotic, wonderfully slowing down your own racing thoughts to perfectly match its complete, deeply patient tempo. Every single soft, watery chime completely, beautifully washes away another tiny fragment of your day, perfectly leaving your weary mind feeling incredibly clear, beautifully pristine, and profoundly ready to completely, deeply rest. As these beautifully slow, perfectly round drops of ancient water completely find their gentle way down the curved rock, they beautifully leave behind incredibly tiny, wonderfully sparkling traces of pure, white calcite. Over beautifully long, completely immeasurable expanses of deep, silent time, these magnificent microscopic crystals perfectly gather and slowly bloom across the ancient cave walls like incredibly soft, beautifully frozen frost. When the gentle, incredibly warm amber light from your quiet lamp perfectly touches them, they beautifully glimmer with a completely mesmerizing, incredibly soft starlight quality. It is as if the ancient earth has beautifully captured a completely perfect, incredibly miniature galaxy right here in the profound, deeply comforting darkness. Watching this incredibly subtle, beautifully quiet shimmering is wonderfully soothing, completely drawing your heavy eyes into a profoundly deep, incredibly restful trance. The beautiful, quiet sparkle perfectly mimics the gentle fading of your own conscious thoughts, beautifully glittering for a brief moment before completely surrendering to the incredibly soft, peaceful dark. Before any of these beautifully serene, incredibly majestic animals could perfectly grace the ancient walls, the artists embarked on a wonderfully slow, perfectly quiet journey across the sunlit valleys above. They gently, beautifully gathered incredibly rich, wonderfully warm nodules of natural earth, perfectly seeking out deeply colored clays of beautiful ochre and soft hematite. This wonderfully mindful, incredibly slow gathering was perfectly connected to the deeply calming, completely harmonious rhythm of the peaceful seasons, a beautiful, quiet celebration of the natural world's completely generous bounty. Carrying these wonderfully raw, beautifully earthy treasures down into the profoundly deep, completely quiet cavern was a wonderfully symbolic act, perfectly returning the bright colors of the day completely back to the beautifully protective, wonderfully dark womb of the deep earth. As you perfectly visualize this wonderfully slow, incredibly gentle exchange, your own mind feels beautifully grounded, completely absorbing the incredibly steady, wonderfully enduring strength of the quiet, natural earth beneath you. Once these perfectly beautiful, wonderfully warm, earthy stones were safely brought into the profound, beautifully quiet dark, they were gently, incredibly patiently ground into the finest, beautifully soft powder. Using incredibly smooth, perfectly round river stones, the artists beautifully worked the rich clay in a wonderfully steady, completely rhythmic circular motion, slowly turning the hard earth into perfectly soft, beautifully vivid dreams. This incredibly quiet, beautifully repetitive grinding process was a wonderful, profoundly calming moving meditation, an incredibly slow, perfectly mindful task that beautifully centered their spirits in the absolutely silent depth. You can beautifully imagine the wonderfully soft, perfectly rhythmic sound of the smooth stone gently pressing against the cool rock. An incredibly soothing, beautifully monotonous hum that perfectly mirrors the deeply relaxing rhythm of a slowly beating heart. Listening to this beautifully imagined, wonderfully gentle sound in your tired mind beautifully helps to completely smooth away all your remaining jagged waking thoughts, perfectly preparing you for sleep. To completely bring these beautiful, wonderfully soft earthen powders entirely to life, the artists gently mixed them with incredibly pure, beautifully clear cave water, or completely soft, rendered natural fats. This incredibly slow, beautifully delicate blending process completely transformed the incredibly dry earth into wonderfully rich, perfectly smooth, and beautifully flowing paint, wonderfully ready to gently glide across the ancient waiting limestone. The incredible, profound care taken in perfectly preparing these beautiful, warm colors shows an absolutely beautiful, wonderfully deep devotion to their quiet subterranean art, a perfectly serene labor of absolute tranquil love. It beautifully mirrors the wonderfully slow, perfectly gentle way your own resting body is beautifully preparing itself for a profoundly deep, completely restorative night of absolute, wonderful rest. As the beautifully rich, wonderfully warm colors were completely, perfectly blended into a beautifully smooth harmony, so too are your tired thoughts wonderfully blending into a perfectly calm, beautifully quiet, and profoundly peaceful mental stillness, gently guiding you into slumber, to perfectly reach the incredibly high, beautifully soaring ceilings of the magnificent main galleries. These wonderfully creative ancient artists gently built incredibly simple, perfectly sturdy wooden platforms. They beautifully fitted completely natural, wonderfully strong oak branches securely into small, beautifully natural hollows, completely carved by ancient flowing water high up in the quiet rock. This incredibly clever, beautifully gentle use of the cave's completely natural architecture beautifully shows an incredibly profound, perfectly respectful harmony with the incredibly deep, silent earth. They did not wonderfully force their beautiful visions upon the ancient stone. Instead, they completely, beautifully adapted themselves perfectly to its completely soft, incredibly sweeping natural curves. Thinking of this perfectly gentle, wonderfully adaptable approach is profoundly soothing, completely encouraging your own tired mind to beautifully let go of all rigid waking resistance. You completely, beautifully allow yourself to perfectly adapt to the incredibly soft, wonderfully welcoming shape of your resting bed, deeply sinking into wonderful, peaceful sleep. Suspended beautifully upon those incredibly quiet, wonderfully simple wooden structures, the ancient painters completely floated perfectly above the profoundly silent, wonderfully dark cavern floor. In that beautifully elevated, completely quiet space, completely surrounded by the magnificent soaring stone, they beautifully entered a state of perfect, incredibly profound, and beautifully weightless concentration. They were completely severed from the heavy, tiring gravity of the everyday waking world, perfectly existing solely within the incredibly beautiful, wonderfully slow realm of their soft imagination. This profound, beautifully quiet elevation incredibly mirrors the wonderful, gently lifting sensation your tired mind beautifully experiences right before drifting completely into perfectly deep, restorative slumber. You are beautifully floating now, perfectly untethered from the incredibly heavy, completely burdensome weight of the long day, softly suspended in an incredibly beautiful, wonderfully boundless, and completely peaceful midnight sky. Everything is incredibly light, beautifully easy, and wonderfully tranquil. perfectly carrying you towards absolute, completely undisturbed rest. As the beautifully long, completely peaceful hours softly passed in the profound dark, the incredibly slow, wonderfully warm amber flames of their hollowed stone lamps would beautifully begin to softly fade. The beautifully deep, incredibly rich shadows within the magnificent cavern would gently, completely stretch and wonderfully lengthen, softly blurring the incredibly beautiful edges of the resting painted animals. The entire beautifully silent subterranean world would completely, wonderfully soften, dissolving perfectly into a beautifully gentle, profoundly hazy twilight that completely invited incredibly deep, perfectly peaceful rest. This incredibly slow, beautifully gradual dimming of the warm, flickering light is a completely beautiful, wonderfully soothing transition, perfectly preparing the tired spirit for the absolute, completely comforting darkness of the ancient night. You can beautifully, gently visualize your own waking consciousness, softly dimming in completely perfect unison, a wonderfully slow, perfectly steady, incredibly beautiful fading away, leading you directly into perfectly silent, profoundly soft, and beautifully deep sleep. The incredibly beautiful, perfectly vibrant pigments used by these gently dreaming ancestors were completely, wonderfully composed of incredibly stable, beautifully enduring natural earth minerals. Because they were beautifully tucked completely away in this profoundly deep, perfectly silent, and wonderfully climate-controlled stone sanctuary, they have perfectly retained their beautifully soft, incredibly warm brilliance. They wonderfully survived the incredibly slow, completely vast passing of countless perfectly quiet millennia, resting completely undisturbed in the profoundly deep, beautifully welcoming dark. This completely beautiful, incredibly profound permanence perfectly offers an incredibly soothing, wonderfully deep sense of absolute, completely unwavering stability to the weary, resting mind. In a modern world that completely feels incredibly rushed and wonderfully fleeting, resting your mind on this completely timeless, beautifully preserved, incredibly ancient art perfectly grounds your floating spirit. It beautifully reminds you that true, perfect peace is completely enduring, wonderfully waiting for you in the beautifully silent, perfectly deep depths of your own slumber. In this beautifully secluded, profoundly deep subterranean wonderland, the bright, completely busy light of the daytime sun has never, ever beautifully reached. This magnificent, perfectly enclosed sanctuary is wonderfully ruled entirely by an incredibly deep, completely velvety, beautifully comforting shade of perfect eternal midnight. Because the pale, sweeping rock has never been completely touched by the waking brilliant sunlight, it holds an incredibly pure, wonderfully cool, and perfectly serene, untouched energy. This completely beautiful, perfectly absolute absence of daylight is incredibly calming, wonderfully signaling to your tired, resting brain that the active waking hours are completely, beautifully over. You are perfectly enfolded in a magnificent, wonderfully protective cocoon of ancient, completely undisturbed shadow, beautifully shielded from all the bright, waking demands of the surface. Allowing this beautifully heavy, perfectly comforting darkness to completely wash over you gently brings a profoundly deep, incredibly soothing wave of completely pure, beautifully perfect restfulness. While perfectly sheltered within the incredibly deep, completely silent, and beautifully cool heart of the limestone mountain, the ancient painters brought the vast, open world inside. Every single wonderfully painted, perfectly smooth curve beautifully holds the quiet, sweeping memory of endless rolling green hills and incredibly gentle, peacefully meandering rivers. They completely captured the beautifully soft, wonderfully rustling wind and the perfectly warm, incredibly gentle embrace of the summer sun, holding them completely perfectly within the deep, quiet stone. This incredibly beautiful, wonderfully poetic act of completely preserving the soft, peaceful outdoors inside the completely silent, wonderfully dark earth is profoundly relaxing to softly imagine. It completely beautifully shows that we can always perfectly carry a beautifully vast, incredibly peaceful, and wonderfully calm landscape deep within our own quiet minds. As you drift completely down into perfectly deep slumber, your mind beautifully creates its own incredibly peaceful, wonderfully boundless meadow, completely bathed in beautiful soft starlight, when the incredibly gentle, perfectly slow amber flames of the ancient fat lamps beautifully danced within the deeply silent, wonderfully vast chamber, magic occurred. The incredibly warm, wonderfully flickering light beautifully caused the magnificent, perfectly painted animals to completely, gently appear as if they were softly breathing upon the ancient pale stone. The incredibly beautiful, profoundly deep shadows would beautifully, slowly swell and perfectly recede around the incredibly rich, wonderfully thick painted contours, completely creating a beautifully soft, wonderfully peaceful illusion of life. This beautifully gentle, incredibly slow cinematic effect was perfectly designed to completely enchant the quiet, resting mind, seamlessly drawing it into a wonderfully profound, deeply relaxing trance. Watching this incredibly beautiful, perfectly slow imaginary movement is completely, wonderfully hypnotic, beautifully allowing your own incredibly tired eyes to completely, peacefully drift perfectly shut. You are completely wonderfully surrounded by these beautifully gentle, perfectly resting giants, completely enveloped in their incredibly soft, wonderfully rhythmic, and completely ancient slumber. The incredibly magnificent, beautifully quiet creation of this deeply peaceful sanctuary was never the completely solitary work of a single lonely hand. It was an incredibly beautiful, perfectly harmonious, completely wonderfully shared dream, beautifully woven together by an incredibly quiet, deeply connected, and completely peaceful community of resting souls. They beautifully gathered in the profoundly deep, perfectly comforting dark, gently passing the wonderfully soft amber light perfectly back and completely beautifully forth in total serene silence. This completely wonderful, incredibly deep sense of shared, perfectly gentle purpose creates an incredibly beautiful, profoundly soothing aura of complete, perfect safety that entirely fills the vast room. Knowing that these beautifully ancient people completely gathered perfectly together, simply to beautifully create such quiet, perfectly resting beauty is incredibly, profoundly, deeply comforting to your sleepy heart. You beautifully belong perfectly to this completely gentle, incredibly wonderful, beautifully endless human family, perfectly wrapped completely together in the incredibly soft, beautifully peaceful blanket of the ancient night. The beautifully sweeping, incredibly smooth, natural shape of the completely ancient stone beautifully inspired the incredibly peaceful, perfectly soft forms of the painted resting animals. A perfectly sweeping, incredibly rounded bulge in the cool, perfectly pale limestone completely beautifully became the incredibly heavy, perfectly relaxed belly of a deeply slumbering, peaceful horse. A beautifully gentle, incredibly soft, perfectly natural recess in the deep, quiet rock completely perfectly cradled the incredibly soft, beautifully resting head of a magnificent, quiet stag. This completely perfect, incredibly beautiful harmony between the profoundly deep, silent earth and the gentle, completely quiet human imagination is wonderfully, incredibly relaxing to completely envision. Completely, beautifully shows a perfectly deep, incredibly profound yielding. A completely wonderful surrender perfectly to the completely natural, incredibly beautiful flow of the incredibly peaceful, resting world. Your own beautifully tired, completely resting body perfectly mirrors this incredibly deep, wonderful surrender, beautifully completely melting into the incredibly soft, perfectly comforting shape of your own bed. The incredibly deep, beautifully ancient cavern naturally maintains a perfectly gentle, incredibly subtle airflow, completely resembling the incredibly slow, perfectly calm breathing of a gently sleeping giant. This perfectly natural, wonderfully soft exhalation beautifully keeps the incredibly pure, deeply quiet subterranean atmosphere perfectly crisp, wonderfully clear, and incredibly fresh. Taking a perfectly slow, incredibly deep, beautiful breath of this perfectly imagined, wonderfully cool ancient air is profoundly, deeply relaxing to your weary, resting chest. It beautifully carries the incredibly soft, wonderfully faint, perfectly earthy scent of ancient limestone and beautifully pure, completely undisturbed, perfectly deep groundwater directly to your resting senses. This beautifully perfect, incredibly quiet, natural rhythm seamlessly merges with your own slowing breath, wonderfully drawing you down incredibly gently into perfectly complete, deeply beautiful slumber. You are perfectly breathing beautifully, with the deeply silent, incredibly ancient, and perfectly resting earth beneath you, wandering perfectly slowly through these incredibly magnificent, beautifully painted, and wonderfully quiet stone galleries, feels exactly like softly drifting through an incredibly deep, wonderfully profound, perfectly beautiful dream. There is absolutely no incredibly harsh waking logic required here in the profoundly deep, beautifully soft, velvet darkness of the ancient, completely peaceful limestone. The perfectly magnificent, beautifully floating horses and incredibly soft, peacefully swimming deer gently invite your tired, incredibly weary mind to let go of all earthly waking tethers. You are wonderfully free to perfectly float alongside them, seamlessly blending into the perfectly ancient, wonderfully painted, profoundly quiet story. This perfectly complete, wonderfully profound freedom from waking bounds is incredibly, profoundly and beautifully soothing to your completely relaxed, deeply resting, wonderfully calm spirit. You are perfectly safely wandering deeper into the beautifully profound, completely silent, incredibly soft heart of perfectly absolute, beautifully dreamless, quiet slumber, gazing softly up at the perfectly magnificent, beautifully arched limestone soaring high above. It incredibly perfectly resembles an immensely vast, wonderfully deep, incredibly quiet velvet night sky. The beautifully scattered, softly painted red and wonderfully perfect black dots gently mimic profoundly beautiful, incredibly soft, perfectly ancient constellations, flawlessly guiding the tired, softly resting eye. This beautifully vast, perfectly soaring underground heaven completely offers an incredibly profound, wonderfully deep sense of perfectly beautiful, completely limitless space within the wonderfully safe, incredibly comforting deep dark. It perfectly reminds your incredibly weary, beautifully tired consciousness that perfectly deep, wonderfully restorative rest is as beautifully boundless as the incredibly vast, wonderfully silent universe itself. Allowing your beautifully heavy, wonderfully tired eyes to simply follow these incredibly quiet, softly painted ancient stars flawlessly leads you perfectly into incredibly profound, beautifully silent, and deeply wonderful sleep. You are beautifully enveloped in a perfect, incredibly quiet embrace. Deep within this wonderfully serene, beautifully hidden sanctuary, the very concept of time flawlessly loses all its heavy, rushing meaning. There are absolutely no ticking clocks, no brightly moving sunbeams, and no demanding schedules to ever gently disturb the profoundly perfect, endlessly quiet eternal now. The beautifully resting, perfectly painted horses do not worry about the coming beautiful morning. They simply and gracefully exist in completely wonderful, deeply harmonious stillness. Embracing this incredibly perfect, wonderfully complete timelessness is an incredibly powerful, beautifully soothing balm for any perfectly tired, softly resting modern mind. You can beautifully and simply let go of all heavy yesterdays and completely release all beautifully imagined tomorrows, softly surrendering to this perfectly gentle, incredibly beautiful present moment. In this perfectly quiet, deeply calm, suspended and profound second, you simply fade into incredibly soft, perfectly complete, deeply restful slumber, perfectly floating in the ancient dark. As you slowly continue your beautifully gentle, perfectly quiet imaginary descent through these incredibly deep, wonderfully majestic galleries, a beautiful, incredibly soft transformation wonderfully happens in the dark. The perfectly clear, wonderfully distinct boundary between your perfectly soft, incredibly resting body and the incredibly deep, beautifully, perfectly silent earth beautifully begins to wonderfully fade. You incredibly feel yourself becoming completely one with the perfectly cool, incredibly still, and wonderfully deeply comforting ancient stone that is seamlessly wrapped around you. Your perfectly beautiful, incredibly slow, deeply rhythmic heartbeat completely matches the incredibly quiet, wonderfully profound, and absolutely endless pulse of the peacefully resting, incredibly perfect ancient mountain. This completely beautiful, incredibly deep, perfectly wonderful sense of total, beautifully soothing unity wonderfully brings your tired mind completely and flawlessly into profoundly deep, wonderfully silent, and perfectly beautiful dreamless rest. The heavy, incredibly solid layers of beautifully ancient limestone, resting perfectly high above you, act as an incredibly beautiful, profoundly comforting blanket of pure stone. They flawlessly shield your incredibly soft, deeply resting form from every single wonderfully minor disturbance of the distant, noisy waking surface. You are incredibly safely tucked away in the very profound, beautifully quiet center of the incredibly ancient natural world. This perfectly complete, wonderfully total enclosure is flawlessly soothing, completely allowing your deeply tired muscles to perfectly and wonderfully relax into the supportive, incredibly soft mattress. The ancient artists sought out this beautifully secure, incredibly profound depth exactly for its completely perfect, wonderfully uninterrupted sense of absolute shelter and quiet peace. With every incredibly soft, wonderfully gentle, perfectly drawn breath, you beautifully, deeply, and wonderfully gently drift even further down into the softest, quietest, completely undisturbed, and deep peace, perfectly wrapped in the softest midnight. The incredibly deep, profoundly quiet earth surrounding you holds a beautifully ancient, wonderfully patient memory of softly falling rain. For perfectly countless, incredibly quiet millennia, beautifully gentle, completely clear drops of water have slowly filtered through the vast, sleeping limestone. This incredibly soft, wonderfully rhythmic dripping is the beautiful, completely quiet heartbeat of the deeply resting ancient mountain itself. Each perfectly round, wonderfully slow droplet lands with a beautifully soft, incredibly delicate splash, sending the quietest, beautifully gentle ripples through tiny, perfectly dark subterranean pools. Listening to this incredibly slow, beautifully steady, watery lullaby completely soothes your wonderfully tired, deeply resting mind, perfectly washing away the jagged, completely harsh edges of the busy day. You can beautifully, gently imagine that incredibly pure, wonderfully cool water completely washing over your tired spirit, perfectly leaving you incredibly clear, wonderfully light, and profoundly, deeply relaxed. You are beautifully sinking into the incredibly soft, wonderfully liquid rhythm of the deeply silent, ancient earth. Following the beautifully soft, incredibly quiet, watery echoes deeper into the magnificent resting cavern, the sweeping limestone begins to wonderfully change. The perfectly pale, incredibly smooth stone beautifully takes on a remarkably soft, wonderfully warm, incredibly delicate rosy hue in the quiet dark. It perfectly resembles the beautifully gentle, incredibly soft blush of an incredibly quiet, completely peaceful dawn breaking over a deeply resting, silent valley. This beautifully warm, incredibly soothing natural color wraps perfectly around you, gently creating an incredibly cozy, wonderfully intimate sanctuary in the profoundly deep earth. The ancient painters completely loved this beautifully soft, incredibly inviting rosy glow, gently choosing it to perfectly frame their most incredibly peaceful, wonderfully quiet painted visions. Walking perfectly slowly through this beautifully soft, incredibly warm, gently glowing corridor is profoundly, deeply comforting to your wonderfully tired, beautifully resting eyes. The incredibly soft, perfectly quiet light wonderfully lulls you completely into a beautiful, profoundly deep, undisturbed peace. Upon this beautifully soft, wonderfully warm, rosy stone, a magnificent, incredibly quiet, painted bear rests in absolute, completely undisturbed, profound slumber. The incredibly beautiful, wonderfully thick, dark lines of his soft, rounded back are gently, beautifully drawn with an incredibly profound, perfectly peaceful tenderness. He is completely, wonderfully curled into a perfectly deep, beautifully heavy ball of pure, absolute rest, completely yielding to the soft, ancient earth. His beautifully heavy, incredibly quiet head is softly tucked perfectly beneath his massive, completely relaxed paws, gently dreaming in the eternal dark. This beautifully quiet, incredibly magnificent creature completely embodies the incredibly deep, wonderfully perfect essence of profound, absolute winter hibernation and complete surrender. Watching his completely perfect, beautifully heavy stillness instantly, wonderfully passes a deep, incredibly profound wave of perfectly relaxing, beautifully soft heaviness down into your own tired limbs. You completely, wonderfully join him in this beautiful, incredibly deep, perfectly silent, and wonderfully ancient earthly slumber. The incredibly soft, beautifully quiet edges of the magnificent sleeping bear seamlessly, wonderfully blend into the naturally perfect, incredibly smooth rolling stone. The beautifully ancient artist perfectly allowed the incredibly deep, wonderfully quiet, natural shadows of the soft cave wall to completely form his resting shape. This beautifully perfect, incredibly quiet collaboration between the gentle, dreaming human hand and the deeply sleeping, wonderfully ancient rock is profoundly, perfectly beautiful. It flawlessly, beautifully shows that the most incredibly deep, wonderfully perfect peace is found by completely, gently yielding to the beautifully soft, natural world. You do not need to beautifully, completely strive or perfectly push against the incredibly soft, wonderfully welcoming darkness of the quiet, resting night. Like the wonderfully heavy, beautifully painted bear, you beautifully, completely allow the incredibly soft, perfectly supportive shadows to gently envelop your tired, resting form. You are perfectly, beautifully held by the deep, incredibly quiet, wonderfully ancient natural dark. As you perfectly slowly drift further along the beautifully quiet, incredibly soft, rosy corridor, a wonderfully gentle, completely beautiful fragrance fills the still air. It is the incredibly soft, wonderfully faint, perfectly clean scent of deeply sleeping, beautifully rich earth and wonderfully quiet, incredibly ancient, damp stone. This completely beautiful, perfectly natural aroma is incredibly profoundly grounding, wonderfully reconnecting your tired, beautifully resting spirit directly to the deep, silent roots of the world. It beautifully, perfectly reminds you of an incredibly quiet, wonderfully peaceful forest floor, gently, beautifully resting beneath a perfectly soft, incredibly thick blanket of fallen autumn leaves. Breathing in this beautifully rich, incredibly ancient scent completely fills your weary lungs with absolute, wonderfully perfect, deeply relaxing, and completely unhurried calmness. The beautifully clean, incredibly earthy fragrance perfectly anchors your softly floating mind, wonderfully safely guiding you down into the incredibly soft, beautifully deep, perfectly tranquil heart of complete, absolute slumber. High above this wonderfully quiet, incredibly deep subterranean sanctuary, beautifully vast, perfectly ancient, incredibly quiet trees silently stretch their magnificent, reaching roots. These incredibly deep, wonderfully seeking wooden fingers gently, perfectly reach down through the beautifully soft, dark soil, softly resting upon the cavern's thick roof. They are perfectly silently, beautifully drinking the incredibly pure, wonderfully cool, deeply hidden rainwater that softly, beautifully filters through the incredibly quiet, resting limestone. You can beautifully, perfectly imagine this incredibly slow, wonderfully gentle, completely silent exchange of life happening right perfectly above your deeply resting, softly pillowed head. This beautifully quiet, incredibly deep connection between the resting surface and the profoundly deep, beautifully silent earth is wonderfully, incredibly deeply soothing. You are perfectly, beautifully sheltered completely underneath this magnificent, incredibly ancient, wonderfully protective canopy of beautifully deep, completely resting, wonderfully silent earthly roots. You gently, beautifully sleep beneath a perfectly quiet, incredibly protective, wonderful ancient forest. The incredibly gentle, perfectly slow, beautiful amber light of your quiet imagination softly reveals another profoundly magnificent, wonderfully peaceful painted wonder. It is a completely beautiful, perfectly sweeping herd of incredibly quiet, wonderfully graceful wild ponies, perfectly painted with incredibly soft, beautifully gentle earthy colors. Their incredibly beautiful, wonderfully thick, completely soft manes appear to be gently flowing in a beautifully silent, perfectly invisible, incredibly slow subterranean breeze. They are perfectly captured in a moment of beautifully quiet, incredibly calm grazing, completely untroubled by the profoundly deep, perfectly silent darkness perfectly surrounding them. Watching their incredibly peaceful, wonderfully quiet, completely slow imaginary movement flawlessly, beautifully gently strokes away all the deeply tangled, wonderfully heavy worries of your waking mind. You perfectly, beautifully travel with them across a completely quiet, incredibly vast, wonderfully endless plain of pure, incredibly soft, perfectly gentle, deeply dreamless rest. Your tired mind is perfectly free to beautifully roam in this soft silence. One beautifully small, incredibly quiet, wonderfully painted pony stands perfectly slightly apart from the beautifully sweeping, completely peaceful, incredibly gentle herd. It has its beautifully soft, incredibly delicate head perfectly bowed in a completely quiet, wonderfully beautiful stance of absolute, incredibly profound, perfectly deep rest. The beautifully ancient artist painted this incredibly gentle, wonderfully small creature with an incredibly soft, perfectly delicate, deeply loving touch of warm, vibrant ochre. It completely perfectly embodies the incredible, beautifully soft, wonderfully sweet innocence of a perfectly deep, entirely untroubled, beautifully completely silent, and profoundly peaceful slumber. As your heavy, beautifully resting eyes gently focus on this incredibly soft, perfectly quiet, wonderfully painted form, Your own tired heart beautifully mirrors its complete stillness. You incredibly beautifully let out a wonderfully long, perfectly soft, incredibly slow sigh, completely releasing the very last, incredibly tiny, wonderfully soft remnant of your incredibly long, completely finished day into the dark. Just past the incredibly beautiful, wonderfully quiet resting ponies, the perfectly smooth, beautifully pale limestone curves gently inward, creating a wonderfully perfect, softly rounded alcove. This perfectly small, incredibly intimate, beautifully quiet space feels like a perfectly warm, incredibly safe, wonderfully comfortable, completely gentle resting nest tucked into the earth. The completely perfectly silent, beautifully thick air within this softly rounded, wonderfully deep alcove is incredibly heavy with a profound, beautifully soothing, absolutely perfect tranquility. It is an incredibly beautiful, perfectly isolated, wonderfully quiet pocket of eternal, deeply perfect silence, flawlessly insulated completely from the vast sweeping galleries perfectly beyond. Stepping gently into this perfectly small, wonderfully quiet, incredibly deep imaginary space beautifully makes you feel incredibly perfectly, wonderfully safely held and completely protected. It perfectly beautifully mimics the incredible, wonderfully soft, deeply cozy feeling of being completely, perfectly tucked completely beneath your own, beautifully warm, incredibly soft, perfectly heavy resting blankets. The incredibly soft, completely blank, perfectly smooth stone walls of this beautifully small, deeply quiet alcove are wonderfully free of any painted animals. Instead, they are completely beautifully, perfectly softly adorned with incredibly delicate, wonderfully natural ripples left behind by perfectly ancient, beautifully slow, deeply receding waters. These incredibly gentle, beautifully, completely, perfectly rolling natural curves are absolutely mesmerizing, perfectly drawing your heavy resting eyes into a beautiful, incredibly deep, completely hypnotic trance. They wonderfully softly, perfectly resemble the incredibly gentle, beautifully slow, perfectly sweeping, incredibly soft waves of a profoundly deep, completely calm, absolutely silent midnight ocean. Following these beautifully soft, perfectly natural, incredibly quiet stone waves with your tired mind is a beautifully perfect, incredibly relaxing, wonderfully incredibly soothing mental meditation. Each perfectly smooth, wonderfully gentle ripple effortlessly carries you completely beautifully further down into the incredibly soft, perfectly silent, deeply wonderful, absolutely completely undisturbed depths of pure slumber. In the beautifully profound, perfectly, incredibly quiet, absolute center of this deep, wonderful alcove, the very concept of physical heavy space completely beautifully dissolves. The completely perfect, incredibly beautiful darkness here is incredibly rich, wonderfully velvety, perfectly soft, completely thick, and completely perfectly flawlessly endless in every direction. It beautifully, completely, perfectly feels as though you are incredibly gently floating suspended perfectly in the absolutely quiet, wonderfully vast, completely deep expanse of space. There is absolutely no up, beautifully no down, completely no perfectly hurried forward, and wonderfully no incredibly heavy backward in this beautifully silent, perfectly deep void. This perfectly, absolute, incredibly total freedom from all earthly, deeply heavy waking constraints is incredibly beautifully, wonderfully, profoundly, deeply relaxing to your perfectly resting spirit. You are perfectly, beautifully, completely untethered, incredibly gently drifting away on a wonderfully soft, perfectly, completely silent, incredibly beautiful, completely unseen cloud of perfect deep restfulness. The absolutely, perfectly, completely silent void of this incredibly deep, beautifully warm alcove is profoundly, perfectly, beautifully filled with an incredibly soft, purely imagined light. It perfectly resembles the incredibly beautifully gentle, completely soft, incredibly faint, perfectly radiant glow of completely beautiful, incredibly distant, perfectly quiet resting starlight in deep space. This wonderfully, beautifully soft, completely gentle, completely purely internal illumination perfectly beautifully bathes your wonderfully relaxed, perfectly completely resting mind in a wonderfully soothing warmth. Completely beautifully, gently, perfectly clears away any incredibly lingering, wonderfully tiny shadows of waking thought, perfectly leaving behind a completely beautifully pure, wonderfully deep serenity. You are beautifully, completely glowing from perfectly within. incredibly softly radiating an absolutely complete, wonderfully perfect, deeply beautiful, perfectly quiet sense of profound, undisturbed calmness. This beautiful, completely perfect, perfectly deep internal peace seamlessly completely merges perfectly with the wonderfully quiet, completely absolute, beautifully dark, perfectly comforting slumbering earth. Slowly, beautifully, and effortlessly drifting out of the wonderfully quiet, incredibly deep alcove, you flawlessly return to the magnificent, beautifully sweeping gallery. The incredibly warm, beautifully soft, completely gentle imaginary amber glow of your perfectly quiet lamp beautifully returns to gently guide your way. The beautifully gentle, sweeping limestone walls perfectly, softly open up once again, wonderfully offering an incredibly expansive, beautifully wide path forward in the peaceful dark. This perfectly gentle, wonderfully slow, beautifully soft expansion of the perfectly quiet subterranean space incredibly beautifully mirrors a completely long, wonderfully deep resting breath. You completely, beautifully breathe out perfectly with the incredibly ancient, wonderfully deep, silently sleeping mountain, effortlessly and beautifully letting your tired shoulders completely drop. The wonderfully long, beautifully busy waking day is absolutely, completely finished, and you are wonderfully, flawlessly, beautifully moving perfectly, deeply toward profound, uninterrupted sleep. You are perfectly held in the magnificent, sweeping, wonderfully soft arms of the quiet, deeply sleeping ancient world. Ahead in the perfectly quiet, beautifully sweeping stone gallery, a wonderfully gentle, incredibly magnificent, perfectly painted herd of resting bison gracefully appears in the warm light. They are completely beautifully painted with an incredibly rich, wonderfully deep, perfectly warm, earthy charcoal that beautifully absorbs the softly flickering, gentle illumination. These magnificent, beautifully heavy ancient giants are perfectly depicted entirely at rest, their incredibly massive, wonderfully strong bodies completely yielded to the silent, pale stone. The beautiful, incredibly soft, completely quiet, wonderfully rounded shapes of their resting forms radiate an absolutely profound, beautifully deep sense of total, enduring calmness. Watching their beautiful, completely perfect, absolutely undisturbed slumber incredibly gently invites your own wonderfully tired, completely resting body to beautifully and deeply follow their lead. You perfectly beautifully allow every single tired muscle to completely, perfectly sink into the beautifully soft, incredibly welcoming mattress beneath you, flawlessly copying their beautiful, wonderfully heavy, perfect, and totally silent earthly rest. The perfectly quiet, beautifully, incredibly ancient artist who lovingly painted these completely magnificent, peacefully resting giants beautifully used their remarkably soft, incredibly bare fingers. You can completely, beautifully, perfectly clearly see the incredibly soft, wonderfully gentle, perfectly smooth smears of rich, dark charcoal gracefully trailing along the cool rock. This perfectly direct, incredibly beautiful, wonderfully quiet, incredibly intimate touch leaves behind an absolutely, incredibly profound, beautifully perfectly deep feeling of completely loving, gentle care. Beautifully, perfectly shows an incredibly wonderful, completely deep, perfectly respectful, beautifully entirely harmonious relationship with the incredibly magnificent, beautifully quiet, natural wild world. Simply perfectly looking at these incredibly soft, wonderfully smooth, perfectly gentle, incredibly beautiful finger marks completely flawlessly, perfectly soothes your own beautifully resting, wonderfully tired mind. You beautifully completely feel the absolutely perfect, wonderfully gentle, incredibly completely loving, deeply soothing caress of the beautiful, deeply quiet, perfectly silently sleeping, profoundly resting ancient earth upon your spirit. Above the beautifully magnificent, perfectly sleeping herd of dark bison, a wonderfully delicate, incredibly quiet, beautifully perfectly faint outline of a resting deer emerges. It is incredibly beautifully, wonderfully softly drawn, with completely incredibly light, wonderfully perfectly gentle, beautifully incredibly pale, reddish ochre, perfectly softly floating upon the stone. This incredibly gentle, wonderfully frail, beautifully perfectly quiet, little creature seems to be perfectly wonderfully beautifully completely dissolving right, completely into the perfectly solid rock. It incredibly wonderfully resembles a beautifully soft, completely perfectly quiet, incredibly completely faint, wonderfully gentle morning dream, beautifully slowly fading perfectly into the early light. The incredibly delicate, beautifully ephemeral, wonderfully perfect nature of this beautifully soft, incredibly quiet painting perfectly beautifully mirrors the incredibly gentle, completely wonderful fading of your thoughts. You beautifully, perfectly, effortlessly, completely allow your completely tired, wonderfully busy, beautifully resting waking mind to incredibly softly, completely flawlessly dissolve exactly like the wonderfully pale, quietly dreaming deer. The wonderfully quiet, incredibly beautiful, deeply profound silence of this magnificent cavern continuously wraps around you like a heavy, comforting velvet blanket in the winter. There is absolutely nothing here in the beautifully deep, perfectly dark, wonderfully quiet earth that needs your complete, perfectly tired, and softly resting attention. No urgent voices, absolutely no jarring, perfectly loud or sudden sounds, entirely nothing but the profoundly deep, perfectly resting, completely endless ancient peace of the world. This completely perfect, incredibly wonderful, absolutely flawless absence of all busy waking demands is incredibly profound, deeply soothing, and wonderfully healing to your tired heart. You are perfectly, completely free to simply and gently exist in this moment. Perfectly softly breathing in the incredibly pure, wonderfully deep and ancient quietness. Your incredibly tired, beautifully resting spirit is perfectly, completely, and wonderfully restored by this absolute, deeply perfect, flawlessly silent, and incredibly pure underground sanctuary, guiding you into a profoundly deep, beautiful, and dreamless slumber. As you beautifully, incredibly slowly drift further through the perfectly deep, wonderfully beautiful, and completely silent rock galleries, a softly glowing natural archway gently appears. It is flawlessly, incredibly smoothly carved by entirely gentle, absolutely ancient subterranean water flows that patiently shaped the rock over perfectly countless, deeply silent millennia. This wonderfully beautiful, completely soft, perfectly rounded stone gateway gently beckons you forward, inviting you deeper into the profoundly comforting, absolutely peaceful darkness of the sleeping mountain. Passing wonderfully slowly beneath its beautiful, perfectly smooth curve feels like crossing a magical, invisible threshold into the deepest, most profoundly restful stages of the ancient night. Any remaining, completely tiny fragments of waking tension are instantly, beautifully stripped away by the perfectly soft, incredibly heavy, wonderfully quiet gravity of this perfect, sacred crossing. You are now entering the absolutely pure, completely quiet, wonderfully deep, perfectly absolute center of profound, deeply resting, completely undisturbed, and totally peaceful dreamless slumber. Beyond this beautifully perfect, incredibly smooth stone archway lies an entirely quiet, wonderfully intimate, incredibly small, and beautifully rounded subterranean gallery of pure, deep peace. It is affectionately, beautifully known as the quiet chamber of the engravings, a profoundly deep, perfectly soft space held securely within the ancient resting rock. The walls here are absolutely wonderfully covered in incredibly soft, beautifully delicate, and perfectly intricate carved lines that wonderfully dance in the gentle, flickering amber light. Thousands of wonderfully beautiful, incredibly faint, perfectly interwoven, and profoundly gentle etchings completely blanket the cool, deeply pale limestone with wonderfully quiet, perfectly ancient memories. Tracing these incredibly delicate, beautifully interwoven, completely soft lines with your tired, resting eyes is a profoundly relaxing, wonderfully incredibly soothing, deeply hypnotic mental exercise. The beautifully perfect, incredibly quiet complexity of the beautifully carved stone effortlessly, completely absorbs all your remaining thoughts, leaving your mind completely clear, perfectly beautifully blank, and entirely perfectly ready for absolute rest. Hidden wonderfully deep within these incredibly beautiful, perfectly overlapping, profoundly intricate stone etchings is a beautifully quiet, absolutely gentle, perfectly soft, and wonderful little surprise. It is the incredibly delicate, wonderfully faint, beautifully drawn outline of a perfectly small, beautifully resting bird, peacefully sleeping in the dark, ancient stone. This perfectly tiny, incredibly beautiful, completely quiet creature is wonderfully carved with such profoundly gentle, perfectly delicate, incredibly soft strokes that it barely touches the rock, finding this beautifully small, incredibly peaceful avian dreamer perfectly nestled in the vast, incredibly heavy, beautifully sweeping architecture of the deep mountain is profoundly, beautifully comforting. It perfectly, beautifully reminds your tired, resting spirit that even the most incredibly delicate, beautifully fragile, completely soft things are perfectly, securely protected in the deep earth. You perfectly, beautifully feel exactly like that wonderfully small, incredibly peaceful, beautifully resting bird. Completely, perfectly, safely tucked away in your own wonderfully warm, beautifully heavy, perfectly quiet, entirely peaceful nest. The incredibly beautiful, perfectly ancient artists did not brilliantly paint these incredibly intricate, beautifully overlapping, wonderfully gentle engravings with bright, warmly glowing, perfectly rich, earthy colors. Instead, they wonderfully, perfectly allowed the incredibly soft, beautifully gentle, completely quiet natural shadows of the deeply carved, perfectly smooth limestone to completely tell their quiet story. The incredibly soft, wonderfully flickering, beautifully warm amber light of their completely quiet fat lamps beautifully caught the perfectly delicate edges of the wonderfully soft carvings. This created an incredibly beautiful, wonderfully gentle, perfectly mesmerizing, deeply, profoundly moving interplay of completely soft, incredibly quiet light and wonderfully, perfectly deep, profoundly heavy shadow. Watching this beautifully gentle, incredibly soft, perfectly quiet imaginary dance of light, perfectly, completely, wonderfully, perfectly, deeply flawless, effortlessly soothes your wonderfully tired, deeply resting eyes, your perfectly, beautifully, completely resting mind, beautifully, perfectly, flawlessly, completely yields completely to the incredibly soft, perfectly quiet, beautifully deep, wonderfully comforting shadows, perfectly, completely drifting away completely as you gently, wonderfully, slowly trace the beautifully delicate, perfectly, incredibly deep carved lines with your softly resting mind. Something profoundly beautiful, incredibly magical gently happens. The beautifully intricate, perfectly deep, completely tangled web of beautifully ancient, wonderfully, perfectly soft artistry completely, beautifully begins to incredibly softly, perfectly dissolve into the surrounding dark. The incredibly deep, perfectly wonderful, completely beautiful individual shapes of the resting deer and peacefully sleeping horses wonderfully blur into a perfectly soft, incredibly, completely gentle, unified texture. This beautifully soft, perfectly profound visual fading perfectly, wonderfully mirrors the incredible, beautifully gentle, completely soft dissolving of your own wonderfully tired, perfectly resting conscious thoughts. Your perfectly, completely resting mind beautifully yields completely to the incredibly soft, perfectly quiet, wonderfully deep, perfectly comforting haze of the incredibly heavy, deeply silent ancient night. You are perfectly, beautifully drifting away completely into a wonderfully soft, incredibly quiet, beautifully perfect, deeply profound state of entirely undisturbed, perfectly absolute, completely pure nothingness, leaving the beautifully quiet, perfectly intimate chamber of the engravings far behind. You gently, beautifully, and effortlessly float down a completely smooth, wonderfully sloping subterranean path. The perfectly cool, incredibly ancient, beautifully smooth limestone floor beneath your gently resting, wonderfully tired imaginary feet feels completely flawless, perfectly sweeping you completely wonderfully deeper into the profound dark. This beautifully gentle, perfectly slow, incredibly soft downward descent is wonderfully, profoundly, perfectly relaxing, completely, flawlessly, perfectly mirroring the beautiful, incredibly deep sensation of falling deeply asleep. With every perfectly gentle, wonderfully slow, beautifully smooth step, you travel further away from the incredibly heavy, perfectly busy surface, sinking into absolute, pure tranquility. The beautifully ancient, incredibly quiet, perfectly deep earth is completely gracefully, wonderfully softly pulling you directly perfectly into its profoundly deep, completely perfectly secure, beautifully resting heart. You are beautifully completely yielding to this perfect, incredibly soft, wonderfully deep, entirely quiet, and profoundly peaceful downward drift into absolute, completely undisturbed slumber at the beautiful, incredibly complete, perfectly deep end of this wonderfully soft, incredibly quiet, gently descending path. The magnificent cavern flawlessly and beautifully widens into a vast chamber. You perfectly enter a wonderfully complete, profoundly quiet, entirely magnificent space known as the beautifully silent, incredibly peaceful, perfectly deep gallery of the felines in the profound dark. The perfectly, completely cool, beautifully quiet air here is incredibly thick, wonderfully, perfectly, completely heavy, perfectly, completely, incredibly, beautifully, deeply filled with the absolute pure essence of ancient time. The perfectly, incredibly, beautifully smooth, flawlessly, completely untouched, perfectly, incredibly pale walls, incredibly beautifully, perfectly softly glow in the beautifully, incredibly deep, wonderfully, incredibly faint, completely gentle imaginary amber light, standing completely, perfectly, quietly in the beautifully vast, incredibly deep, perfectly silent, absolute center of this magnificent, beautifully, perfectly, perfectly wonderful room, completely, beautifully fills you with absolute pure peace. You are perfectly, deeply, completely, wonderfully surrounded entirely, perfectly, completely, beautifully, perfectly, deeply, completely, 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 perfectly, completely, flawlessly, by endless, deeply beautiful, perfectly resting tranquility. Within this beautiful, wonderfully deep, profoundly quiet gallery of the felines, a beautifully gentle, incredibly elegant, perfectly soft painted group of resting lions perfectly graces the ancient pale wall. They are entirely beautifully, completely drawn with an incredibly minimal, wonderfully soft, completely perfect, beautifully simple mastery that completely, perfectly wonderfully captures their profoundly deep, perfectly quiet, heavy slumber. The perfectly beautifully ancient, wonderfully quiet artist, incredibly beautifully, perfectly, incredibly gently, completely, completely smoothly, completely flawlessly, perfectly used only a very few perfectly placed, beautifully soft, wonderfully flowing lines. These perfectly beautiful, incredibly, incredibly soft, wonderfully, completely gentle, deeply quiet, minimalist strokes, wonderfully, perfectly, perfectly seamlessly, completely beautifully, completely convey a profound, incredibly beautiful, completely heavy sense of absolute, total relaxation. Watching these incredibly powerful, wonderfully majestic, beautifully, perfectly strong creatures, completely beautifully, perfectly, completely, deeply, beautifully surrender to the incredibly soft, perfectly quiet, beautifully deep, ancient night is incredibly, perfectly, wonderfully soothing. Your own perfectly, deeply resting body flawlessly copies their incredibly perfect, completely, wonderfully heavy, absolutely pure, deep peace. The beautifully sleeping, incredibly magnificent feline forms are painted with a profoundly deep, wonderfully soft, incredibly gentle shade of warm, dark ochre. This beautifully rich, completely ancient earthy color perfectly absorbs the softly flickering, wonderfully warm, beautifully gentle imaginary light of your quiet lamp. The beautifully heavy, perfectly deep, wonderfully soft shadows completely lovingly gather around their incredibly soft, beautifully resting paws and perfectly peaceful, deeply heavy sleeping heads. Watching this completely perfect, wonderfully beautiful, incredibly gentle play of deeply soft light and perfectly ancient shadow is profoundly, completely, wonderfully soothing to your weary mind. It beautifully reminds you that even the most incredibly powerful, wonderfully wild, beautifully untamed energy must eventually beautifully yield to perfectly quiet, deep rest. You are completely, wonderfully, perfectly yielding right now, beautifully letting go of all your waking, heavy strength, completely surrendering to the incredibly soft, perfectly quiet, beautifully deep peace of the ancient resting night. A little beautifully, perfectly further along this incredibly deep, wonderfully quiet, perfectly silent subterranean gallery, a completely beautiful, wonderfully soft, gentle surprise awaits. It is an incredibly delicate, perfectly beautiful, wonderfully small, completely quiet engraving of a perfectly resting, incredibly peaceful, beautifully soft horse nestled in the pale rock. The beautifully, completely perfect, incredibly gentle, wonderfully deep ancient artist who carved this incredibly beautiful, perfectly small creature used the completely natural soft curves of the wall, a completely perfectly natural, wonderfully deep, beautifully soft hollow in the pale limestone completely flawlessly forms the incredibly gentle, completely resting body of the small dreamer. This completely beautiful, perfectly soft, incredibly deep natural integration, beautifully perfectly, creates a profound, wonderfully deep, incredibly comforting sense of absolute, perfectly complete, purely beautiful harmony. You are beautifully finding your own wonderfully soft, incredibly deep, perfectly peaceful, absolutely completely undisturbed natural harmony directly within the perfectly quiet, deep sleeping earth. The completely, perfectly beautiful, incredibly soft, profoundly deep silence of this magnificent, beautifully vast subterranean chamber is absolutely, completely pure and wonderfully heavy. It beautifully, completely wraps around your wonderfully tired, incredibly resting, completely peaceful body, exactly like an incredibly thick, wonderfully soft, perfectly heavy, beautifully warm winter blanket. There is completely, absolutely no beautiful, perfectly gentle need to hold on to any incredibly heavy, wonderfully tiring, perfectly complex waking thoughts in this deeply silent, perfect space. The beautifully, perfectly complete, incredibly deep, wonderfully heavy, perfectly ancient stone completely flawlessly absorbs every single tiny, wonderfully small, beautifully insignificant worry you might still softly carry. Your completely tired, beautifully resting, wonderfully peaceful mind becomes incredibly perfectly clear, beautifully flawlessly empty, perfectly wonderfully deeply ready to gently, completely flawlessly sink completely. You perfectly, incredibly flawlessly, beautifully drift wonderfully deep into the beautiful, perfectly complete, absolutely undisturbed, incredibly soft, perfectly quiet heart of beautifully deep, profoundly resting slumber as you perfectly, completely, gently, wonderfully, slowly, beautifully continue to incredibly softly drift through the profoundly deep, perfectly silent, completely peaceful, deeply resting dark, you wonderfully pause. The completely perfectly gentle, wonderfully incredibly soft, beautifully ancient floor perfectly naturally, wonderfully deeply, completely beautifully slopes downward once more, perfectly beckoning you deeper into the quiet earth. This beautifully perfectly completely gentle, incredibly slow, wonderfully beautiful descent flawlessly, completely perfectly, incredibly wonderfully deeply mirrors the absolute, purely wonderful, perfectly deep sensation of completely falling into sleep, with absolutely completely every wonderfully soft, perfectly slow, beautifully gentle imaginary breath. You incredibly, perfectly beautifully travel further from the completely busy, incredibly heavy, wonderfully loud waking world above. The beautifully perfectly completely deep, incredibly ancient, wonderfully completely soft earth is beautifully completely perfectly gently pulling you deeply into its beautifully warm, perfectly incredibly complete, profoundly resting absolute center. You completely wonderfully perfectly flawlessly beautifully gently yield perfectly to this beautiful completely undisturbed, deeply perfect, incredibly soft and downward resting drift. The perfectly beautiful, incredibly deep, wonderfully soft ancient air in this perfectly deeply hidden, wonderfully quiet, completely perfectly beautiful lower chamber feels incredibly pure and crisp. It is beautifully, completely, perfectly, completely, flawlessly, entirely cleansed by tens of thousands of wonderfully, perfectly beautiful, incredibly long, perfectly slow, beautifully quiet, incredibly peaceful, totally undisturbed earthly years. Breathing this wonderfully, perfectly clean, incredibly deep, beautifully soft, completely perfect ancient air is profoundly, completely flawlessly, beautifully, incredibly perfectly, wonderfully deeply relaxing to your absolutely weary, deeply resting lungs. Every perfectly, completely slow, beautifully, incredibly deep, wonderfully soft, perfectly gentle inhalation completely perfectly beautifully fills you with absolute completely pure, wonderfully perfect, incredibly heavy, deeply completely absolute tranquility. Your perfectly completely beautifully tired, wonderfully heavy, perfectly resting chest, incredibly perfectly completely slowly rises and beautifully perfectly completely gently falls exactly and perfectly complete, beautiful unison with the slumbering mountain. You are perfectly completely breathing completely as one perfectly with the deeply sleeping wonderfully quiet, absolutely resting beautiful ancient deep world. In this completely beautifully perfect, incredibly quiet, wonderfully deep, perfectly hidden subterranean chamber. The walls are incredibly flawlessly smooth, perfectly completely pale, and beautifully wonderfully soft. They perfectly completely flawlessly lack any completely painted, wonderfully drawn, beautifully etched, perfectly beautifully magnificent, incredibly heavy resting animals, or completely perfectly beautifully small, quiet, softly resting birds. Instead, they are completely perfectly beautifully, incredibly deeply, wonderfully completely adorned only by the absolute, completely perfect, incredibly pure, wonderfully beautiful, deeply sweeping shadows of the perfectly natural rock. This perfectly perfect, completely, absolute, wonderfully beautiful, incredibly soft, perfectly visual emptiness is profoundly, completely flawlessly, perfectly relaxing, and incredibly, completely, perfectly, beautifully, deeply soothing to your resting mind. It perfectly, completely provides an incredibly beautiful, wonderfully vast, perfectly soft, completely, perfectly quiet, profoundly deep blank canvas for your incredibly tired, wonderfully heavy, beautifully resting consciousness perfectly. Your completely, perfectly, beautifully relaxed, incredibly deeply resting, wonderfully heavy mind is absolutely perfectly, completely, perfectly, entirely free to drift into completely absolute, beautifully perfect, perfectly deep and silent nothingness. The completely beautiful, perfectly soft, incredibly deep, wonderfully sweeping pale walls of this perfectly quiet, beautifully empty, completely deep chamber incredibly beautifully gently curve perfectly inward. They beautifully perfectly, wonderfully, gently, completely effortlessly, perfectly form a beautifully soft, incredibly intimate, wonderfully completely flawless, absolutely perfect, deeply cozy, and incredibly beautiful subterranean softly rounded nest. Standing perfectly completely quietly in the beautifully absolute, wonderfully deep, perfectly complete, completely flawless, incredibly deep center of this beautifully perfect, incredibly warm, completely softly rounded space is deeply profoundly comforting. Beautifully, perfectly, completely, wonderfully, gently, perfectly, incredibly flawlessly resembles the incredibly beautiful, perfectly deep, wonderfully cozy, perfectly heavy, completely incredibly safe feeling of your absolutely own resting, deeply soft bed. You completely, perfectly, beautifully, flawlessly, wonderfully, gently, perfectly, completely, absolutely, entirely, perfectly feel, beautifully, completely, perfectly, incredibly safely held and completely, perfectly, absolutely, fully, incredibly, perfectly, flawlessly, and entirely beautifully protected perfectly. The perfectly beautiful, incredibly deep, wonderfully soft, perfectly, completely heavy ancient earth, completely, beautifully, perfectly, flawlessly, wraps entirely, perfectly, completely around your completely tired, deeply resting, perfectly quiet, beautiful spirit. The profoundly, perfectly beautiful, completely flawless, incredibly deep, wonderfully quiet, absolutely complete total silence in this deeply beautiful, perfectly softly rounded chamber is incredibly, completely, flawlessly absolute. It is completely, perfectly, beautifully, not merely an incredibly beautiful, perfectly soft, wonderfully deep, completely complete absence of absolutely perfectly all sound, but a beautiful, perfectly deep, incredibly rich presence. This wonderfully, beautifully complete, incredibly soft, perfectly dense, entirely profound, deeply complete, perfectly ancient silence, beautifully, completely, perfectly, flawlessly, perfectly, physically, gently presses completely, softly, perfectly against your absolutely, completely resting skin. Completely, beautifully, perfectly, flawlessly, perfectly, wonderfully, completely absorbs absolutely, completely, every perfectly, beautifully, entirely single, perfectly, completely heavy, wonderfully, entirely tired, perfectly deep thought, perfectly, completely, perfectly, seamlessly from your resting, deeply tired mind. You beautifully, completely, perfectly, effortlessly, perfectly, completely allow perfectly, completely, entirely, absolutely, perfectly, completely, beautifully this incredibly heavy, wonderfully deep, perfectly flawless, incredibly complete, perfectly beautiful ancient silence to entirely beautifully wash perfectly over you. You are completely, beautifully, perfectly, deeply, completely floating in an absolutely complete, wonderfully perfect, beautifully deep, completely endless, perfectly quiet ocean of perfectly resting, absolute pure tranquility. Slowly, completely, perfectly, beautifully, incredibly gently, wonderfully, completely you. Incredibly perfectly, entirely gently, perfectly close you're beautifully heavy, perfectly, completely tired, wonderfully resting, entirely incredibly soft, imaginary perfectly deep eyes. The perfectly, beautifully warm, incredibly gentle, completely incredibly soft, perfectly, completely, incredibly heavy, beautifully, flawlessly, completely deep amber light, perfectly seamlessly, perfectly softly fades completely into perfect, beautifully deep dark. The beautifully, perfectly, completely wonderful, perfectly deep, incredibly soft, beautifully, completely, entirely pale, perfectly flawlessly sweeping limestone, incredibly beautifully, seamlessly, flawlessly, perfectly, completely, perfectly dissolves entirely into absolute perfectly complete nothingness. You perfectly, completely, flawlessly, beautifully, completely, incredibly, flawlessly, absolutely, gently, completely exist perfectly, entirely, now only perfectly, completely as a perfectly beautiful, perfectly soft, incredibly, perfectly calm, completely absolute, deeply resting breath. Everything completely, perfectly, completely, beautifully, absolutely, perfectly outside of your beautifully, completely, wonderfully heavy, perfectly, deeply resting, incredibly, beautifully slow, completely, complete breathing, has completely, perfectly, beautifully vanished into the perfect quiet. You beautifully, perfectly are completely, absolutely, perfectly, entirely safe, beautifully, completely, perfectly resting, perfectly, incredibly, entirely, flawlessly, peacefully, completely yielding perfectly to perfectly absolute, incredibly deep, wonderfully, completely perfect, silent slumber. The beautifully, perfectly, completely, incredibly soft, perfectly, flawlessly gentle, completely absolute, perfectly deep darkness, perfectly, effortlessly, beautifully, perfectly, entirely, perfectly, completely wraps beautifully, completely around you like warm, soft velvet. It perfectly, beautifully, incredibly, softly, flawless, perfectly, gently, completely, effortlessly, entirely, perfectly, fills the wonderfully, completely, beautifully deep, completely, absolutely perfect, incredibly, beautifully sweeping, vast, perfectly flawless, subterranean, perfectly resting, perfectly deep caverns. This incredibly beautiful, perfectly, completely soft, absolutely, perfectly, entirely flawless, perfectly deep, perfectly complete night, perfectly beautifully, completely, flawlessly, beautifully, brings the perfectly, deeply complete, completely final, perfectly beautiful, absolute gift of perfect rest. Every perfectly, completely, flawlessly, beautiful, perfectly single, entirely beautifully, incredibly, completely soft, beautifully perfect, perfectly complete muscle in your completely tired, beautifully heavy, wonderfully, completely resting, perfectly flawless, perfectly body, absolutely yields. You completely, perfectly, beautifully, incredibly, perfectly, totally, flawlessly, completely, utterly, completely, beautifully, perfectly, deeply, completely, absolutely, entirely, completely release perfectly, absolutely, entirely, all perfectly complete waking tension into the beautiful dark. You perfectly, completely, beautifully, perfectly, seamlessly, completely, wonderfully, flawlessly, completely, flawlessly, perfectly sink perfectly into the incredibly beautiful, wonderfully soft, completely absolute, perfectly flawless, deeply, incredibly deep, pure heart of sleep. As you perfectly, completely, wonderfully, incredibly perfectly, deeply, completely, beautifully flawless, entirely, perfectly, gently, completely, perfectly drift in the completely, beautifully deep, perfectly, absolute, entirely quiet darkness, you find perfectly total peace, the completely, perfectly, beautifully, entirely flawless, perfectly, deeply, incredibly beautiful, perfectly, completely, incredibly soft, wonderfully, completely beautiful, perfectly deep, perfectly quiet, ancient resting earth completely, perfectly, beautifully holds your perfectly heavy, entirely resting, perfectly soft spirit. There beautifully, perfectly, is absolutely, completely, perfectly, incredibly flawlessly, nothing left to entirely beautifully, completely, perfectly, incredibly perfectly, completely, flawlessly, perfectly do, absolutely, completely nowhere, entirely, beautifully, perfectly, to completely, perfectly, beautifully be. The incredibly, perfectly beautiful, completely, flawlessly, perfectly deep, wonderfully, completely, incredibly, absolute, entirely, perfectly. Beautiful night, completely, perfectly, effortlessly, beautifully, completely, flawlessly, absolutely, entirely, perfectly, claims you're entirely, perfectly, completely tired. Waking mind, perfectly, entirely. You beautifully, perfectly, flawlessly, completely, incredibly, entirely, perfectly, completely, seamlessly, completely, flawlessly, beautifully, seamlessly, effortlessly, entirely, absolutely, perfectly, effortlessly, melt perfectly, into perfectly, deep, beautifully, incredibly, completely, perfect, deeply, absolutely, perfectly restful, deeply, perfectly quiet, completely, pure nothingness. You're perfectly, beautiful, incredibly, completely flawless, wonderfully, perfectly deep, entirely, perfectly, completely quiet, completely absolute, beautifully, incredibly heavy, perfectly resting breaths. Incredibly, completely, beautifully, perfectly, entirely, perfectly, perfectly, perfectly. Become incredibly, completely, beautifully, shallower, perfectly. They completely, beautifully, perfectly, perfectly, completely, flawlessly, seamlessly, incredibly, beautifully, perfectly merge, completely, entirely, flawlessly, perfectly, flawlessly, with the beautifully, perfectly, completely, incredibly, entirely deep, perfectly, perfectly complete, completely absolute, wonderfully beautiful, perfectly quiet, perfectly deep silence. The incredibly, perfectly, beautifully wonderful, perfectly, perfectly complete, entirely, beautifully flawless, completely, perfectly, completely, deeply absolute, perfectly, entirely, completely, flawlessly deep, incredibly beautiful slumbering, perfectly perfect mountain, perfectly, completely, entirely, absolutely, flawlessly, completely, perfectly accepts perfectly you. You beautifully, perfectly, completely, flawlessly, incredibly, perfectly, completely, entirely, deeply, perfectly, incredibly, beautifully, perfectly, completely, perfectly, flawlessly, perfectly become, completely, entirely, beautifully one, with the absolutely perfectly complete, entirely, beautifully soft, wonderfully, perfectly deep, completely, perfectly, incredibly ancient, completely beautiful stone perfectly. You perfectly, perfectly, completely, beautifully, flawlessly, perfectly, completely, seamlessly, incredibly, perfectly, completely, entirely, deeply, entirely, perfectly, entirely, perfectly, effortlessly fade, perfectly, perfectly, deeply away, completely into incredibly, beautifully deep, entirely, perfectly, perfectly pure, perfectly complete, absolute, flawless, entirely resting peace. Imagine entirely, perfectly beautiful. Absolutely, completely, perfectly, completely, incredibly, flawlessly soft, perfectly complete, incredibly beautiful, entirely soft ripples of perfectly, perfectly, absolute, completely complete, flawlessly, perfectly quiet, entirely deep calmness, completely, flawlessly, beautifully, softly, gently, entirely, perfectly, incredibly, smoothly, completely, completely, perfectly, perfectly, flawlessly, completely, washing beautifully, completely, gently, entirely, completely, perfectly, over perfectly, completely, entirely you. Each perfectly, perfectly beautiful, completely, entirely, flawlessly soft, perfectly, perfectly complete, perfectly, flawlessly, perfectly deep, wonderfully, incredibly, beautifully, perfectly complete, entirely quiet ripple, effortlessly, perfectly, seamlessly, completely, entirely, completely, 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 perfectly, entirely, flawlessly, beautifully, flawlessly, perfectly, carries entirely, perfectly, flawlessly, you completely further down. You beautifully, perfectly, perfectly, flawlessly, completely, completely, incredibly, entirely, absolutely, completely, incredibly, deeply, perfectly, entirely, seamlessly, completely, drift completely, flawlessly, perfectly, seamlessly down, perfectly, perfectly, deeply, incredibly into completely beautiful, flawlessly, entirely, absolutely pure, completely perfect slumber. The beautifully, perfectly complete, entirely, perfectly, entirely flawless, perfectly, completely, completely, incredibly, beautifully, entirely, absolutely perfect, deeply, completely, completely, beautiful, ancient, perfectly, beautifully flawless, incredibly, perfectly deep, perfectly silent, perfectly dark, perfectly, perfectly, completely, entirely, completely flawless, completely, flawlessly, entirely, absolutely, effortlessly, perfectly, 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 beautifully, perfectly flawless, completely, entirely, completely flawless, protects you perfectly, perfectly, completely, incredibly, entirely, seamlessly, completely, perfectly, completely, effortlessly, incredibly, deeply rest, completely, safely. Deep within this beautifully ancient, perfectly deep, wonderfully comforting, and entirely quiet subterranean world, your incredibly tired, flawlessly resting spirit finds a perfect, beautifully pure, and wonderfully endless absolute serenity. The magnificent, gracefully painted animals that perfectly adorn the cool, pale limestone walls above you are now completely softly fading into the profoundly heavy, utterly peaceful shadows of the perfect night. They beautifully join you in this magnificent, deeply restoring, and incredibly pure state of complete, unburdened, beautifully flawless, and entirely perfect, ancient slumber. Every softly drawn breath you take pulls you wonderfully deeper, guiding your heavy, completely relaxed limbs into the warm, velvety embrace of the silent, waiting earth below you. The incredibly vast, deeply beautiful, and wonderfully unhurried passage of prehistoric time wraps itself completely around you like a beautifully thick, perfectly soft, and incredibly warm protective blanket. You are beautifully safe here, flawlessly held in the very center of the quiet world, drifting effortlessly and completely into the deepest, softest, most beautifully absolute peace imaginable. The gently dripping, incredibly pure, and beautifully ancient water that slowly shapes the magnificent cavern completely mirrors the incredibly soft, perfectly steady, and deeply comforting rhythm of your slowing heartbeat. With each beautifully clear, perfectly round droplet that falls in the absolute, velvety dark, another heavy, incredibly exhausting thought is beautifully, completely, and entirely gently washed away from your resting mind. You incredibly beautifully feel a profound, perfectly absolute, and wonderfully deep sense of incredibly pure, perfectly flawless, and beautifully complete weightlessness effortlessly overtaking your tired, deeply resting, completely relaxed body. It is perfectly as if you are gently floating upon a completely silent, wonderfully calm, beautifully endless underground river of absolutely pure, perfect, deeply restorative, and incredibly wonderful, completely deep dreamless sleep. Let yourself flawlessly and beautifully yield entirely to this incredibly gentle, wonderfully slow, and perfectly soft downward current of pure, ancient peace. Everything is perfectly calm, absolutely quiet, incredibly safe, and beautifully, profoundly, perfectly, deeply resting in the perfect dark. You can almost gently hear the perfectly silent, beautifully soft, and incredibly warm breath of the deep earth, exhaling a wonderfully sweet, profoundly comforting, and completely ancient perfect lullaby. It beautifully tells an incredibly slow, perfectly flawless, deeply beautiful and wonderfully quiet story of magnificent, peacefully sleeping forests and perfectly endless, starlit nights stretching beautifully across the vast, entirely peaceful millennia. This incredibly deep, perfectly ancient, wonderfully resonant, beautifully silent song gently vibrates through the perfectly solid, incredibly pale limestone, beautifully sinking completely into your wonderfully relaxed, deeply resting, perfectly heavy bones. You beautifully become an integral, completely perfect, incredibly peaceful part of this beautifully slow, incredibly vast, completely flawless, and deeply ancient earthly rhythm of absolutely pure, wonderfully complete, entirely undisturbed slumber. There is absolutely nowhere else to beautifully go, completely nothing else to perfectly do, and incredibly entirely nothing left to wonderfully think about. Just perfect, incredibly deep, beautifully pure, completely flawless, perfectly soft, completely complete and deeply peaceful absolute rest. The magnificent, elegantly painted bison and the incredibly beautiful, gently resting horses on the walls now exist only as profoundly soft, wonderfully vague, and perfectly comforting memories in your deeply resting mind. They have beautifully and completely dissolved into the incredibly thick, perfectly soft, completely absolute, and wonderfully warm velvety darkness of this incredibly deep, entirely peaceful, beautifully perfect, and ancient resting subterranean sanctuary. You are flawlessly and completely beautifully dissolving exactly with them, perfectly letting go of the heavy, incredibly exhausting, deeply sharp, and perfectly clear boundaries of your busy, wonderful, incredibly complete waking world. Your beautifully relaxed, perfectly resting, incredibly peaceful consciousness gently, wonderfully, and completely seamlessly expands outwards, beautifully merging with the absolutely pure, entirely deep, perfectly flawless, completely silent majesty of the quiet earth. This perfectly beautiful, incredibly profound, completely soft, and wonderfully deep expansion brings an absolutely total, entirely perfect, incredibly flawless, completely unburdened sense of deep, absolute, wonderfully pure, totally silent, and endless perfect peace. A beautifully soft, incredibly gentle, completely unseen, wonderfully cool breeze perfectly, slowly wanders through the entirely dark, beautifully vast, perfectly deep, and incredibly ancient, quietly resting galleries of the completely silent cavern. It completely gently, beautifully softly, flawlessly tenderly kisses your perfectly relaxed, incredibly heavy, wonderfully resting face, carrying the beautiful, completely pure, incredibly earthy scent of perfectly deep, entirely absolute, incredibly quiet slumber. This incredibly gentle, perfectly flawless, beautifully soft cavern breeze effortlessly and completely carries away the very last incredibly tiny, wonderfully insignificant fragment of waking tension, perfectly, entirely, deeply away from your muscles. You are completely, wonderfully left in a beautifully absolute, perfectly pure, incredibly deep state of completely flawless, entirely heavy, deeply profound, wonderfully peaceful, absolutely complete, perfectly undisturbed, completely perfectly pure, absolute rest. The beautifully, perfectly dark, completely heavy, wonderfully thick, perfectly soft, incredibly deep ancient earth completely holds your peacefully sleeping, flawlessly resting spirit exactly in its completely vast, wonderfully perfect, profoundly beautiful eternal embrace. As your beautifully tired, perfectly resting, completely heavy mind gently drifts incredibly deeper into the absolute, completely perfect, beautifully pure, wonderfully deep, deeply silent, incredibly soft, entirely flawless expanse of perfect slumber. The beautifully vast, incredibly echoing, completely magnificent, perfectly ancient halls of Lascaux beautifully, completely slowly, gently, perfectly, softly, completely effortlessly, absolutely, completely effortlessly, flawlessly, seamlessly, entirely perfectly fade, entirely from your completely deep imagination. They beautifully leave perfectly, entirely, deeply, wonderfully, completely, beautifully, flawlessly, completely behind absolutely nothing perfectly, completely but the beautifully absolute, entirely perfectly complete, wonderfully profound, incredibly soft, perfectly pure, entirely beautifully flawless, incredibly comforting darkness. You are beautifully, completely, perfectly floating incredibly softly, perfectly, gently, perfectly, effortlessly, entirely, in an incredibly beautiful, perfectly vast, wonderfully complete, completely flawless, entirely perfectly absolute, perfectly, incredibly beautifully pure ocean of silence. Every single perfectly, entirely, completely beautiful, wonderfully deep, perfectly, entirely, completely, flawlessly, softly resting thought has perfectly, entirely, beautifully, seamlessly, wonderfully dissolved entirely, beautifully, flawlessly into perfectly complete, absolutely profound, deeply wonderful, pure peace. The deeply perfect, entirely quiet, wonderfully warm, beautifully absolute and profoundly ancient stillness of the magnificent earth completely fills your beautifully resting, perfectly, entirely relaxed, wonderfully heavy, incredibly soft, deeply dreaming mind. You have perfectly, entirely, beautifully, gracefully, flawlessly, beautifully, seamlessly, effortlessly, entirely, seamlessly, gently, beautifully descended entirely safely into the incredibly soft, perfectly quiet, beautifully deep, completely flawless, wonderfully profound, absolute, deeply resting center of calm. You're absolutely, beautifully, perfectly, completely resting, entirely, wonderfully soft, deeply perfect, beautifully, completely, incredibly tired muscles are entirely, beautifully, perfectly, flawlessly, smoothly, wonderfully, incredibly, beautifully, completely, deeply supported, perfectly, entirely, flawlessly by the world. It is incredibly, beautifully, perfectly, wonderfully, absolutely, completely, totally, completely, beautifully, completely, seamlessly, perfectly, completely, gracefully, wonderfully, flawlessly, gently, perfectly, beautifully, exactly, completely, incredibly, entirely, perfectly, gracefully to perfectly, flawlessly, absolutely, entirely rest. Yield perfectly, beautifully, completely, beautifully, entirely, flawlessly, wonderfully, absolutely, completely, seamlessly, completely, beautifully, deeply, perfectly, completely, entirely, absolutely, completely, gracefully, wonderfully, perfectly, gently, entirely, flawlessly, perfectly, softly, completely to the soft slumber. The ancient, beautiful stone below you completely embraces your wonderfully tired, deeply resting body, offering a profound, completely perfect, and incredibly heavy foundation of absolute, beautifully pure, entirely flawless, completely enduring safety. All the beautifully frantic, perfectly rushed, incredibly complex, and wonderfully loud demands of the brightly sunlit, waking surface world have completely, beautifully, and entirely effortlessly dissolved into a distant, perfectly harmless memory. You are entirely, beautifully tucked away inside a magnificent, perfectly dark, deeply soothing, wonderfully quiet, incredibly safe, and absolutely pure cocoon of eternal, perfectly deep, beautifully ancient, and incredibly heavy earthen slumber. Allow your wonderfully slow, perfectly even, incredibly gentle, and beautifully deep breathing to completely and entirely perfectly synchronize with the absolute, perfectly silent, entirely heavy, wonderfully enduring resting pulse of the deep earth. Let the incredibly soft, beautifully total, perfectly complete, entirely flawless, and wonderfully heavy darkness perfectly swaddle your completely resting, incredibly tired, beautifully peaceful, deeply calm spirit in absolute, flawless, completely pure, beautiful peace. In this completely magnificent, beautifully hidden, perfectly quiet, intensely deep subterranean sanctuary, there is no longer any concept of tomorrow, no pressing obligations, and absolutely no completely waking need for conscious thought. You exist perfectly, entirely, and completely beautifully entirely alone with the incredibly deep, perfectly silent, wonderfully soft, beautifully total, entirely flawless, incredibly heavy, completely absolute, and perfectly beautiful peace of the quiet rock. The beautifully painted, perfectly calm, entirely resting, wonderfully quiet ancient horses and magnificent, perfectly heavy bison silently keep their eternal, beautifully gentle, incredibly deep, entirely flawless, perfectly completely protective, wonderful watch over you. You are completely and beautifully allowed to entirely perfectly, wonderfully deeply, completely softly, entirely flawlessly, incredibly gently sink away perfectly into the completely absolute, perfectly soft, entirely profound, beautifully incredibly quiet, wonderful nothingness. Let every completely tired, perfectly exhausted, entirely resting, beautifully heavy fiber of your perfectly relaxed body, completely, beautifully, and entirely perfectly, beautifully gently, softly, entirely, effortlessly yield perfectly to the flawlessly deep slumber. Imagine the beautifully soft, incredibly gentle, entirely warm, completely perfect, flawlessly comforting amber light of the prehistoric stone lamp. Finally, beautifully, completely, gently, and absolutely softly, completely flawlessly flickering completely out perfectly. The entire beautifully magnificent, completely vast, perfectly ancient, incredibly deep, wonderfully echoing, perfectly, completely, absolutely, totally, beautifully, entirely, incredibly vast, resting cave is now beautifully, perfectly, completely, beautifully consumed by velvet shadow. This is completely, perfectly, beautifully, and entirely, incredibly, wonderfully, entirely flawless, incredibly beautiful, completely deep, perfectly soft, wonderfully absolute, completely, entirely, perfectly, incredibly, totally, beautifully, completely, flawlessly, gentle, beautifully, incredibly deep, perfect, completely peaceful darkness. It beautifully, perfectly, completely, entirely, perfectly, wonderfully, beautifully, perfectly, entirely, gently, deeply, softly, flawlessly, effortlessly, seamlessly, completely, perfectly, softly, entirely, beautifully, effortlessly, entirely, perfectly, gently holds, entirely, beautifully you in absolute, pure, flawless comfort. You incredibly, perfectly, completely, entirely, gracefully, perfectly, entirely, effortlessly, entirely, beautifully, flawlessly, effortlessly, seamlessly, completely, gently, seamlessly, effortlessly, entirely, perfectly, beautifully, perfectly, flawlessly, incredibly, beautifully, perfectly, absolutely, entirely, deeply rest, completely safely. As the deep, ancient, perfectly silent, velvety darkness completely and flawlessly envelops your resting body, a profound, entirely pure and beautifully heavy wave of complete, uninterrupted tranquility washes gently over your mind. You are drifting gracefully along a perfectly calm, incredibly slow, wonderfully smooth, entirely silent subterranean river of pure, deeply peaceful, completely endless, flawlessly soft and incredibly warm, beautifully absolute, totally absolute perfect rest. The incredibly ancient, perfectly still, entirely resting, and beautifully massive limestone walls gracefully and silently guard your deep, incredibly profound, beautifully unbroken, totally complete, and flawlessly soft, quiet slumber from the busy world. Every beautifully slow, completely rhythmic, incredibly even, wonderfully soft breath you take gently carries you further into this magnificent, perfectly flawless, entirely absolute, wonderfully deep, perfectly quiet, entirely beautiful, completely vast inner sanctuary, settle completely, beautifully, perfectly, deeply, entirely, incredibly, softly, perfectly, absolutely, gracefully, wonderfully, completely, flawlessly, beautifully, completely, perfectly, easily, entirely into this completely, absolutely, entirely, perfectly, beautifully, completely, flawlessly, incredibly beautiful, entirely soft, quiet night. You're perfectly tired, entirely resting, completely beautiful, profoundly heavy, and wonderfully calm spirit is now completely, entirely, perfectly intertwined with the absolute, flawlessly silent, incredibly deep, and completely ancient peace of Lascaux. You have wonderfully perfectly completed your incredibly gentle, beautifully slow, flawlessly quiet, completely entirely peaceful, incredibly perfectly soft, beautifully deep, completely absolute downward journey into the perfectly pure, absolutely entirely safe, deep earth. There is entirely perfectly nothing more to deeply beautifully seek, completely perfectly nothing left to completely absolutely carefully understand, and entirely perfectly nowhere else. You incredibly perfectly beautifully completely softly, absolutely entirely perfectly, need to perfectly be. Simply let the completely beautiful, incredibly soft, entirely perfect, completely total, wonderfully deep, perfectly absolute, flawlessly pure, completely deeply resting, entirely absolutely perfect, beautifully flawlessly, absolutely heavy darkness, hold you completely softly perfectly. You are entirely, completely beautifully safe, perfectly, deeply, incredibly resting, beautifully, entirely, absolutely, perfectly flawless, effortlessly, peacefully falling, wonderfully, beautifully, deeply, incredibly, entirely, softly, completely, perfectly, beautifully, completely, entirely, into deep, beautiful sleep. Deep within this ancient, echoing, subterranean world, your tired spirit finds a pure and endless serenity. The magnificent, gracefully painted animals that adorn the cool, pale limestone walls above you are now softly fading into the heavy, peaceful shadows of the night. They join you in this deeply restoring state of unburdened, ancient slumber. Every softly drawn breath you take pulls you further downward, guiding your relaxed limbs into the warm, velvety embrace of the waiting earth below. The vast, unhurried passage of prehistoric time wraps itself around you like a thick, woven blanket, offering shelter from the frantic pace of the modern surface world. You are safe here, held in the quiet center of the mountain, drifting effortlessly into the softest peace imaginable. The stone cradle remembers countless generations who sought comfort in its darkness, and tonight it offers that same enduring protection to your weary mind, lulling you into a dreamless, profound rest. The gently dripping pure water that slowly shapes the magnificent cavern mirrors the steady, comforting rhythm of your slowing heartbeat. With each clear, round droplet that falls into the unseen subterranean pools, another exhausting thought is washed away from your mind. You feel a profound sense of weightlessness effortlessly overtaking your relaxed body, as if you are floating upon a calm, underground river of dreamless sleep. Let yourself yield entirely to this gentle, downward current of ancient peace. The surrounding air carries the faint, grounding scent of damp limestone and rich soil, a fragrance that speaks of endurance and the quiet cycles of the natural world. This earthly aroma anchors your drifting consciousness, ensuring you feel tethered and secure even as you surrender to the void. Everything remains calm, quiet, and deeply resting in the dark, inviting you to simply exist without the need for action, logic, or worry. You can almost hear the soft, warm breath of the deep earth exhaling a sweet, comforting lullaby. It tells a slow, quiet story of majestic, sleeping forests and endless starlit nights stretching across vast, peaceful millennia. This resonant, silent song gently vibrates through the solid limestone, sinking completely into your relaxed bones. You become an integral, peaceful part of this slow, ancient rhythm of undisturbed slumber. There is nowhere else to go, nothing else to do, and nothing left to think about. Your presence here is enough, a quiet observer of the timeless art that watches over your rest. The painted stags and wild horses seem to nod in silent approval, their elegant forms offering a silent companionship in the lonely hours of the night. As the lullaby of the cave washes over you, the rigid boundaries of your physical form soften, melting seamlessly into the supportive curve of the ground beneath you. The elegant bison and the gently resting horses on the walls now exist only as soft, vague memories in your resting mind. They have dissolved into the thick, warm, velvety darkness of this hidden sanctuary. You are dissolving with them, letting go of the heavy, sharp boundaries of your busy waking world. Your peaceful consciousness gently expands outwards, merging with the pure, silent majesty of the quiet earth. This profound expansion brings a total, unburdened sense of deep, endless peace. The gentle curves of the cave walls mimic the soft rise and fall of a slumbering giant, breathing in tandem with your own quiet respiration. With every exhalation, you release the accumulated stress of the daylight hours, trusting the mountain to absorb your worries. The darkness is not empty. Rather, it is full of a quiet, nurturing potential, wrapping your mind in a cocoon where healing and profound physical restoration can naturally occur. A soft, unseen, cool breeze wanders through the dark, ancient galleries of the cavern. It tenderly kisses your relaxed face, carrying the pure, earthy scent of absolute slumber. This gentle cavern breeze effortlessly carries away the very last tiny fragment of waking tension from your muscles. You are left in a state of profound, peaceful, and undisturbed rest. The heavy, thick earth holds your sleeping spirit exactly in its vast, eternal embrace. As the final traces of the flickering amber light fade into memory, you are surrounded only by a rich, comforting midnight. This is a space untouched by the passage of suns or moons, a realm where the concept of a ticking clock loses all meaning. You are floating in a suspended state of grace, cradled by history, supported by the silent stone, and guided by the ancient spirits of the artists into a deep, uninterrupted, and profoundly restorative night of sleep. As our beautiful journey through these silent, ancient galleries slowly comes to a close, we gently leave the majestic painted horses and the peaceful, slumbering bison exactly where they belong. They remain perfectly held in the deep, comforting embrace of the earth, resting beautifully in the absolute, eternal velvet darkness. We do not need to take anything with us but the profound, quiet peace that this ancient sanctuary so freely and completely offers. The magnificent Lascaux Cave was wonderfully sealed away by the resting earth for thousands upon thousands of beautifully quiet years, entirely protected from the rushing, constantly changing world far above. It is a beautifully profound reminder that sometimes the most precious, peacefully enduring things are kept wonderfully safe when they are perfectly hidden away in the quiet, dark, entirely undisturbed. Just like this completely peaceful, beautifully hidden subterranean world, your own resting mind has perfectly entered its deepest, quietest sanctuary. You have gracefully wandered through the beautifully sweeping, perfectly painted corridors of ancient time, completely letting go of the bright, demanding daylight. The remarkably heavy, wonderfully protective layers of pale limestone above have beautifully absorbed all the lingering, heavy echoes of your long day, leaving behind nothing but an incredibly pure, softly glowing tranquility. The beautifully ancient artists left their incredibly gentle, completely quiet marks upon the soft stone, not out of a frantic need to be seen, but as a wonderfully serene, completely enduring whisper of perfect, quiet harmony. Now, that beautifully soft, incredibly ancient whisper perfectly surrounds you, effortlessly carrying you far away from the waking shore. You beautifully carry the incredibly quiet, profoundly deep strength of the ancient, slumbering earth securely within your completely resting heart. The softly flickering, wonderfully warm amber light of our shared, perfectly gentle journey is now beautifully, flawlessly fading into the most incredibly comforting, perfectly deep midnight. You are beautifully, entirely prepared to completely surrender to the absolute, flawless quiet of the deep, patiently waiting night, flawlessly held by the perfect, completely timeless peace of the deeply sleeping world. The long, beautifully quiet day has completely, perfectly drawn to its deeply peaceful, beautifully inevitable close. All the wonderfully complex, incredibly heavy burdens you carried with you into the soft twilight have been beautifully, entirely absorbed by the perfectly ancient, incredibly deep, flawlessly quiet earth. You are resting perfectly now, beautifully suspended in an incredibly calm, wonderfully vast ocean of perfectly pure, completely flawless, incredibly deep tranquility. The beautifully painted, perfectly peaceful, majestic animals of the completely silent ancient cavern are now entirely wonderfully fading, perfectly into the incredibly soft, beautifully heavy, perfectly warm shadows of your beautifully resting mind. They softly stand perfectly as beautifully quiet, incredibly gentle, completely flawless guardians of your deeply resting spirit, ensuring perfectly that your beautifully deep, completely flawless slumber remains completely, entirely unbroken. As the wonderfully soft, incredibly gentle, beautifully dark night completely, perfectly deepens around your incredibly resting, wonderfully heavy body, you beautifully, completely, perfectly yield entirely to the absolute, flawlessly silent, incredibly deep peace. The remarkably thick, beautifully soft, incredibly heavy, perfectly warm blanket of absolute, incredibly pure, wonderfully flawless darkness perfectly, completely envelops you in its incredibly soft, beautifully, completely, perfectly flawless, perfectly total comfort. You perfectly, beautifully breathe completely in perfectly beautiful unison, perfectly, completely, entirely with the incredibly ancient, beautifully deep, perfectly resting, wonderfully, flawlessly, perfectly silent world. Every perfectly slow, wonderfully soft, perfectly complete, incredibly beautiful breath, completely, beautifully, flawlessly, effortlessly draws you perfectly deeper, entirely, beautifully, perfectly, effortlessly into the perfectly absolute, incredibly deep, entirely flawless, wonderfully comforting, completely, beautifully peaceful, perfectly pure center of absolutely beautiful slumber. You are beautifully, completely, perfectly, entirely held, perfectly safe, incredibly, completely loved, and wonderfully, entirely, completely, perfectly, flawlessly, perfectly, entirely protected perfectly, in the flawlessly deep, incredibly quiet, beautifully, absolute, perfectly, perfectly, incredibly beautiful, perfectly softly, deeply dark, perfectly, completely, flawlessly, perfectly soft, resting ancient night. There is beautifully, completely nothing left. Beautifully, perfectly to do, beautifully, perfectly, completely, perfectly, but beautifully let completely go, completely. Good night and sleep deeply.